Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science drifts gently like a tide. Tonight we're going far back in time, to a world before forests, before insects, before anything had ever taken a step onto dry land. The Earth then was almost entirely blue. Waves stretched from horizon to horizon, and beneath them the first great civilizations of life were quietly taking shape. This is the story of when life came out of the ocean, a story that begins in darkness, in salt water, and in silence. It's a tale older than any mountain, older even than the continents as we know them. Wherever you're listening from tonight, perhaps you can imagine that distant ocean. The air around you, the breath you take in and let out, all of it has been part of this planet's endless circulation of water. Once upon a time, every drop passed through those ancient seas, washing over creatures that look nothing like anything alive today. Strange, soft-bodied beings drifted with the current, and tiny plankton shimmered like galaxies in suspension. The world was quieter then. There was no birdsong, no rustling of trees, no chirp or croak or cry. Just the hiss of tides and the hum of a newborn biosphere learning to breathe. Before we dive beneath that surface, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe you're somewhere near the ocean yourself, or perhaps far inland where the nearest waves are locked in stone. Either way, you're still connected to that ancient sea. If you find this kind of quiet science soothing, if you enjoy letting your mind drift through deep time, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd like the video or subscribe. It helps this small corner of calm reach others who might need a gentle voyage through history tonight. Now, let's take a slow breath together. Imagine the world nearly 500 million years ago, the Ordovician Period, the second chapter of the Paleozoic era, following the chaotic creativity of the Cambrian explosion. Life was still almost entirely aquatic, but it had found its rhythm. The oceans had become both nursery and battleground. They shimmered with trilobites crawling across sandy bottoms, with floating jelly-like creatures drifting in the light, and with coral colonies starting to piece together the first real reefs in Earth's history. The land, meanwhile, lay barren and silent, nothing but rock and wind. The colour green had not yet reached the continents. In these ancient seas, sunlight reached only so far. The top layers, called the photic zone, were bathed in light and alive with photosynthesis. Microscopic algae and cyanobacteria captured sunlight and turned it into energy, releasing oxygen that would slowly, over millions of years, change the atmosphere itself. Below that bright layer, darkness returned, cold and still, inhabited by strange forms that glowed faintly or sensed vibrations instead of sight. The water carried minerals from young, restless continents, feeding plankton blooms that coloured the shallows in soft shades of green and gold. If you could stand on the seafloor then, you wouldn't recognise it as the same planet. There were no fish yet, no bones, no true plants, but there were hints of what would come. Tiny shelled creatures, some no bigger than grains of sand, were becoming more common. They secreted calcium carbonate, slowly learning to build protection around their fragile bodies. Others developed primitive jaws or tentacles, small innovations that would ripple through evolution for millions of years. The Ordovician was an age of experimentation, a long and steady refining of what life could be, and above all, there was movement. Continents were not where they are now. The world's land masses were scattered across the southern hemisphere, slowly drifting like rafts on a vast sea of molten rock. What would one day be, North America was then a tropical island continent called Laurentia, surrounded by warm, shallow seas rich with coral and crinoids. To the south, the immense landmass of Gondwana stretched toward the pole, wrapped in glaciers and cold winds that hinted at the ice age to come. The Earth's climate was capricious, warm and tropical near the equator, but cooling over time as carbon dioxide levels fell and sunlight shifted. In those seas, life was becoming more intricate. Animals that had once simply floated began to crawl, burrow and grasp. Predator and prey were learning to outthink each other in slow motion. The first great food webs formed, a cascade of dependence that linked tiny plankton to larger swimmers, then to the towering cephalopods, the nautiloids, rulers of the Ordovician seas. Imagine long conical shells as tall as a human, drifting like spears through the water, their tentacles coiling out to catch prey. They were the first true ocean hunters, the prototypes for squids and octopuses yet to come. The reefs beneath them were bustling microcosms, full of brittle stars, brachiopods and corals. Some corals were solitary, others colonial, slowly growing into structures that would one day harden into limestone cliffs. Over countless generations, their skeletons piled upon each other, turning living reefs into fossilized memory. If you could hold a piece of Ordovician limestone in your hand today, you'd be holding millions of lives compressed into a single stone, each grain a whisper from that ancient sea. At the same time, the atmosphere above was changing in ways no one could yet notice. Photosynthetic microbes in the ocean had been releasing oxygen for hundreds of millions of years, but now the balance began to tip. The air was still thin compared to today, but for the first time, oxygen levels reached a point that would soon allow new kinds of life to take advantage of it. The ocean itself was becoming layered, shallow zones rich in oxygen, deeper zones poor in it. Creatures evolved to fill each niche, some thriving in light and others hiding in the dark. Yet, while life multiplied in the ocean, the land waited. The coastline was still bare, but something was beginning to happen there too. Simple algae and microbial mats started to spread over damp rocks, clinging to surfaces just above the tide. They formed thin green films that shimmered in the light, quietly testing what it might mean to exist between sea and sky. These were the first pioneers of land, though they didn't know it. Over time, they would pave the way for mosses, then ferns, and eventually forests. But for now, the land was only a frontier of moisture and rock. The Ordovician lasted around 41 million years, a long, unhurried interval in the story of Earth. During that time, the number of marine species tripled. Ecosystems became more layered, more complex, and more stable. This diversification laid the groundwork for all future evolution. The reefs provided shelter, the open ocean provided space, and the continents provided new sources of minerals and nutrients as weathering broke down rocks into clay and silt. Rivers carried that material to the sea, enriching it and fueling more growth. It was a planetary feedback loop of chemistry and life, the ocean feeding on the land and life feeding on the ocean. But not everything was peaceful. The Ordovician seas could be violent too. Storms swept across the shallow continental shelves, stirring up sediment and reshaping coastlines. Volcanic eruptions darkened the skies and poisoned the water with metal-rich ash. Mass blooms of plankton could turn seas opaque, starving deeper layers of oxygen and causing die-offs. These were natural cycles of creation and collapse, long before humans, long before anything with lungs or leaves. The planet was learning balance the hard way. And in that push and pull, something miraculous was happening. Complex ecosystems, true communities of life, were beginning to form. Coral reefs were not just structures, but neighbourhoods, with different species coexisting in precise relationships. Tiny worms burrowed through the sand, recycling nutrients. Crinoids stretched their feathery arms to catch drifting food. Trilobites scuttled across the bottom, leaving tracks that would fossilize into records of their daily lives. Every niche, every surface, every current held opportunity. Over time, these systems became more resilient. They could recover from disturbances faster. When one species declined, another often filled its role. This resilience would be tested later, when the first great extinction struck, but for now the oceans thrived. The Ordovician was a period of abundance, of refinement, of life taking its first confident breaths. And through it all, the continents continued their slow drift, unhurried and unstoppable. Mountains rose, weathered, and dissolved. Sea levels rose and fell. The chemistry of the oceans changed subtly, steering evolution in invisible ways. Calcium carbonate became the currency of survival, as shells and skeletons became common tools. In a sense, this was the dawn of architecture, the beginning of organisms shaping not just themselves but their environment. Reefs grew taller, sediments thickened, coastlines hardened. The planet itself began to record life's progress in stone. If you were to float above those waters, watching the slow ballet of early animals, it would feel both alien and oddly familiar. The rules were the same ones that guide ecosystems today. Competition, cooperation, adaptation, and chance. Only the players were different, and while it might have looked still from a distance, change was everywhere. Evolution never stopped adjusting, improving, and reimagining the living world. Somewhere in those shallow seas, a tiny organism found itself drawn toward the edge of the tide. Perhaps it was carried by a current, or trapped in a shrinking pool, or simply clinging to damp rock. It might have been a mat of algae or a simple worm-like creature, struggling against desiccation and sunlight. For a brief moment it experienced something new, the boundary between water and air. That moment, multiplied over millions of years, would become the first step toward everything that would one day crawl, walk, or fly. So as we drift deeper into this story, picture the Ordovician not as a static tableau but as a living pulse. Oceans breathing, continents stirring and life learning. A planet halfway between chaos and order, where every ripple carried potential. The surface glittered with sunlight, the depths whispered with unseen movement, and somewhere in between, the ancestors of all terrestrial life were rehearsing their first steps. Now, the water grows clearer, the sunlight deepens, and our journey continues toward the first great flourishing of marine worlds, a time when the oceans became not just a cradle, but a cathedral of life. The ocean of the Ordovician world was not one single blue expanse, but a patchwork of stillness and turbulence. There were places where the water moved so gently that layers of silt could rest undisturbed for centuries, and others where storms churned the sea with a violence that scattered coral and shattered shells. Between these extremes, life learned to adapt, balancing fragility with resilience, learning how to endure both calm and chaos. To exist in the Ordovician Ocean was to live in a rhythm older than music, driven by currents, temperature, and the turning of the planet itself. If you could have hovered above one of those ancient seas, you might have seen something that looked almost familiar at first. Shallow turquoise water stretched across wide continental shelves, bright with sunlight and rich with life. Below, the seabed was patterned with ripples of sand sculpted by gentle waves and cross-currents. But the closer you looked, the stranger it became. The shapes of the living things below were unlike anything swimming today. Trilobites moved like armoured carpets, dozens of legs working in perfect coordination as they sifted the sediment for food. Sea lilies anchored themselves to rocks, stretching feathery arms upward to catch drifting particles. Worms traced invisible paths through the sand, leaving winding trails that would one day become fossils. The stillness was deceptive. Even in calm water, countless small events were unfolding at every moment. Microbes divided, shells grew, bits of organic matter settled to the bottom and were buried. The seabed was a slow conveyor belt of time, recording each pulse of life in thin layers of mud. When those layers hardened into stone, they would preserve the outlines of shells and bodies in astonishing detail. Every trilobite track, every delicate coral branch, every discarded shell was a sentence in Earth's autobiography, written in sediment rather than ink. Farther from shore, where the light dimmed, the mood changed. The water grew colder and the colour shifted from blue to green to grey. Fewer plants lived here, but the space was not empty. Jellyfish drifted through the twilight, translucent and ancient. their bells pulsing silently as they hunted small plankton. Nautiloids glided past like silent torpedoes, their shells coiled or conical, their tentacles exploring the currents. Some were small enough to hold in your hand, others large enough to rival a human in length. They were the ocean's first great wanderers, able to propel themselves with bursts of jet-like motion, exploring both shallow reefs and open depths. And then, from time to time, everything changed in an instant. Storms rolled across the surface, their winds lashing the waves into chaos. The upper layers of the ocean turned to froth, and the pressure of those storms could be felt far below, where fragile shells were tossed and buried by collapsing currents. When the storm passed, it left behind a reshuffled landscape. Reefs broken apart, sandbars shifted, new channels carved through the sediment. The animals that survived would recolonize the wreckage, starting again as they always had. For them, destruction and renewal were simply parts of the same cycle. The Ordovician atmosphere was different from ours, thinner in oxygen but rich in carbon dioxide. This made the climate warm and humid, and the oceans often teemed with nutrients washed from the eroding continents. Each storm that struck the land released more minerals into rivers, and those rivers carried their cargo to the sea. In coastal shallows, these nutrients fueled blooms of microscopic algae, dense green clouds that turned the water opaque. These blooms were both gift and threat. They provided food for plankton-eating creatures, but they also consumed oxygen, sometimes creating suffocating zones where nothing larger could survive. It was in this delicate balance between abundance and scarcity that life diversified most rapidly. The Ordovician marine ecosystem became layered and interconnected in ways that had never existed before. Small crustaceans grazed on algae. Trilobites scavenged for detritus. Predatory worms burrowed through the sediment, sensing vibrations from above. Corals grew into mounds that sheltered sponges and mollusks. Each creature relied on others, forming webs of energy that reached from sunlight to seafloor. For the first time in Earth's history, ecosystems resembled the intricate communities we recognize today. If you were to follow one of those currents across the world, you'd see how varied the ocean could be. In the tropics, warm, shallow waters hosted reefs so dense with life that their surfaces shimmered like underwater forests. But near the poles, the water turned cold and clear, and life had to adapt to scarcity. The organisms there were fewer, but often larger and hardier, built to endure long stretches of stillness between feeding opportunities. Even then, the world was already divided into biomes: tropical, temperate, polar, each shaped by temperature, light and chemistry. The still zones of the Ordovician Sea were like underwater deserts. They might appear empty, but their emptiness had purpose. These were the basins where organic matter accumulated and was slowly buried. Over millions of years, that burial stored carbon, gradually lowering greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The process was invisible, but it would eventually trigger one of the planet's first great ice ages. The quietest places on Earth were, without knowing it, changing its climate forever. In shallower regions, the story was one of noise and motion. Crinoids swayed in the currents. Briozoans, small colonial animals, built lace-like structures that waved gently with the flow. Starfish moved slowly over the seabed, turning over shells to feed on what lay beneath. Even in calm weather, the movement of the tide stirred the sediment, carrying bits of organic material into the mouths and filters of countless small creatures. Every particle of matter was recycled again and again, passed from one organism to another in an unbroken chain. Predation became one of the driving forces of evolution. The Ordovician saw the rise of the first true hunters, creatures that could seek out prey rather than waiting for it to drift by. Nautiloids used their tentacles to grasp trilobites and small mollusks, cracking them open with sharp beaks. Trilobites in turn developed spines and thicker exoskeletons as defense. This slow arms race created diversity, pushing evolution toward complexity. The peaceful image of a still ocean concealed a constant struggle, quiet but relentless. When night fell, the water changed character again. Sunlight faded, and in the darkness, faint lights began to glow. Bioluminescent organisms filled the sea with pinpoints of colour. It wasn't the kind of brightness that illuminated, but a gentle sparkle like the reflection of stars on water. Most of these lights came from chemical reactions within small plankton, used for defence or attraction. Some creatures glowed to startle predators, others to find mates. In the vast darkness, light became language. If we could somehow listen to that world, it would not be silent. Sound travels far underwater, and the Ordovician Sea was full of faint vibrations, the tapping of shells, the scraping of limbs, the rush of currents. There was no bird song or insect hum, but there was rhythm. The sea itself was the instrument, and life learned to move to its beat. Each creature responded to flow, pressure, and motion. Communication in its earliest form was not about words or sounds, but about sensing change. Over millions of years, the geography of these oceans changed. Continents drifted closer together, closing old basins and creating new ones. Where land masses collided, mountain ranges rose, altering weather patterns. When they separated again, shallow seas flooded the edges of continents, forming broad shelves that became nurseries for life. Each new configuration of land and sea created opportunities for adaptation. Evolution had endless room to experiment. Fossils from this period show evidence of stability punctuated by disruption. Layers of fine sediment, laid down in calm conditions, are sometimes interrupted by thick bands of broken shell and debris, the traces of ancient storms or sudden changes in sea level. In some places, entire reefs were buried, their corals still in place, as if frozen mid-growth. These records tell a story of a world both stable and volatile, where calm could last for millennia, but chaos was never far away. One of the most striking features of the Ordovician was the clarity of its waters. In many regions, the oceans were relatively transparent, allowing sunlight to reach deep into the sea. This light sustained vast mats of algae that carpeted the sea floor. In some areas, these mats trapped sediments and created layered structures called stromatolites, living carpets that were both ancient and newly reborn. They had existed since long before the Ordovician, but here they shared space with a rapidly diversifying cast of animals. The coexistence of the old and the new made the ocean a kind of time machine, a place where ancient lineages and emerging innovations lived side by side. Every so often, volcanic activity reshaped entire coastlines. Underwater eruptions released minerals and heat, creating local ecosystems that thrived on chemical energy rather than sunlight. Around these vents, bacteria fed on sulfides and other compounds, forming the base of unique food webs. This was life independent of photosynthesis, a reminder that biology could exist wherever energy could be captured. Such ecosystems hinted at the possibilities for life beyond Earth, that warmth and chemistry might sustain life even in darkness. As the Ordovician progressed, the interaction between biology and geology deepened. The spread of marine organisms that built shells and skeletons began to draw calcium carbonate out of the water, locking it into solid form. This gradual process not only shaped the ocean floor, but also influenced the atmosphere. Every shell that fell to the seafloor was a tiny act of planetary engineering. The oceans were learning to regulate the planet's chemistry, and life itself was part of that regulation. In the shallows, coral reefs grew like living fortresses. They slowed waves, captured sediment, and created microhabitats for countless smaller species. Crustaceans found shelter between coral branches. Worms tunneled into the carbonate framework. Even dead reefs became new foundations for living ones. These ancient coral systems were the planet's first examples of cooperative architecture, many individuals building something larger than themselves. Meanwhile, the deeper seas continued to evolve their own complexity. Organisms adapted to pressure and darkness developed unique forms, soft bodies, flexible limbs, and sensitivity to even the faintest movement. Predators there relied less on sight and more on vibration or chemical cues. The lack of light didn't mean lack of life. It meant a different kind of life, one that thrived in silence. As oxygen levels in the water rose, animals could grow larger. Energy use became more efficient. The result was a gradual shift in scale, from tiny simple organisms to larger, more active ones. The appearance of big predators like the orthocones, the straight-shelled nautiloids, transformed the balance of the ecosystem. Their presence forced prey species to evolve new defences, creating an evolutionary feedback loop that fueled diversity. The Ordovician was becoming a world of giants compared to what had come before, and yet in all this expansion, the rhythm of the ocean remained steady. The tides continued their daily dance. The moon, already ancient even then, pulled at the waters as it does today. Each rise and fall of the tide left behind shallow pools where life could become stranded, forcing small creatures to develop ways to survive brief exposure to air. In those moments, the boundary between ocean and land grew thin. Life was still bound to the water, but the stage was being prepared for a new experiment, existence beyond the tide. If we could watch it unfold in real time, it would seem impossibly slow. A single generation might see no change at all. But over millions of years, patterns emerged. The shells became stronger, the predators faster, the reefs more complex. Storms reshaped coastlines, but life always returned. The stillness of the sea was never permanent, and the storms were never entirely destructive. Together, they sculpted a world in balance, a world ready for the next leap forward, and somewhere beneath those waves, in the quiet after a storm, a patch of algae clung to wet rock just above the tide line. Its filaments shimmered faintly in the air, exposed for the first time to sunlight unfiltered by water. The tide would come back soon enough, but for that brief interval, something entirely new was happening. A living thing was touching the land. The ocean, vast and ancient, was beginning to share its gift. And as we continue, we'll follow that gift upward, into the currents, reefs, and shifting continents that would turn the Ordovician Sea into the first true global ecosystem, a planet learning to breathe through its own waters. The story of the Ordovician world is, in many ways, the story of construction. Not the kind that raises cities or bridges, but the quiet, patient architecture of living things learning how to build. Before this time, most creatures were soft-bodied, their forms vanishing quickly after death, leaving little trace of their existence. But during the Ordovician, something extraordinary began to happen. Life discovered the power of structure. Tiny organisms started to pull minerals from the water, shaping them into shells, skeletons, and reefs. In doing so, they changed not only their own future, but the chemistry and texture of the entire planet. It began at the smallest scale, invisible to the naked eye. The seas of the Ordovician were full of calcium and carbonate ions, drifting freely in the water. For millions of years, these minerals had remained mostly unclaimed. But slowly, some microorganisms developed the ability to use them, binding the minerals into hard material. At first, this was just a thin coating, a simple layer of protection against being eaten or crushed. But the innovation caught on. Nature rarely forgets a good idea, and once the secret of shell building was discovered, evolution spread it like a whisper through the oceans. One by one, creatures began to arm themselves. Small plankton developed delicate exoskeletons. Worms and early mollusks encased their soft bodies in protective shells. Corals began secreting hard skeletons beneath their soft tissues, anchoring themselves to the seafloor. The ocean was becoming a world of architecture, a place where life no longer simply drifted, it constructed. These shells were more than armour. They were survival strategies, tools that allowed animals to explore new environments. A shell made it possible to withstand currents, to resist predators, and to burrow deeper into sediment. It was a ticket to expansion. Creatures that once lived only in the calmest shallows could now venture into rougher waters. Predators, in turn, adapted to crack or pierce these new defences, evolving stronger jaws and more efficient ways to hunt. The result was an evolutionary arms race that reshaped marine ecosystems. Among the most successful architects were the brachiopods. They looked a little like modern clams but were unrelated, opening and closing their paired shells with a hinge at the rear. Inside, a feathery feeding structure filtered water for food particles. Brachiopods settled across the seafloor in enormous numbers, forming mats of living shells that covered vast areas. In some places they were so dense that the seabed looked like a field of pebbles, each one alive. When they died, their shells piled up, forming limestone beds that still exist today. Trilobites, the old veterans of the Cambrian seas, also benefited from this new architectural revolution. Their exoskeletons became thicker and more ornate, divided into segments that provided both flexibility and defence. Some evolved spines, others flattened bodies for burrowing. They were not builders in the coral sense, but their presence shaped the seafloor all the same. As they burrowed and fed, they churned the sediment, mixing oxygen into it and creating new habitats for smaller organisms. In a way, trilobites were the gardeners of the ocean floor, maintaining its texture and fertility. Then came the corals. In the Cambrian, they had existed only as solitary individuals. Now they began to form colonies, tiny animals joining together to share resources and protection. Each coral polyp built a cup of calcium carbonate around itself and connected with its neighbours. Over time, these colonies grew into complex branching structures that could withstand waves and currents. Layer upon layer, generation after generation, the corals built upward and outward, forming the first true reefs in Earth's history. These reefs were not as colourful as the ones we know today, but they were no less alive. They provided shelter for countless small creatures, sponges, worms, crinoids, and mollusks. Some clung to the outer surfaces, filtering water for food. Others hid in the crevices, safe from predators. The reefs became cities, complete with neighbourhoods, corridors, and hidden chambers. Each colony was a collaboration between thousands of individuals, building something far larger than themselves without ever knowing it. The chemistry of the ocean changed in response. As more creatures drew calcium carbonate from the water, the concentration of those minerals dropped. This shift affected not only marine life but also the atmosphere. When calcium carbonate forms, it locks away carbon dioxide, one of the main greenhouse gases. In other words, the rise of shells and skeletons began to cool the planet. Life was altering climate through construction. The architects of shell and stone were also engineers of temperature, reshaping the Earth's environment molecule by molecule. The consequences were profound. Over millions of years, global temperatures began to decline. The once uniformly warm world developed cooler regions. Ice started to appear on southern continents, setting the stage for the first major glaciation in Earth's history. None of the creatures in the ocean could have known what they were causing, yet their collective efforts were changing everything. Every shell that sank to the seafloor was a carbon sink, every reef a climate regulator. Evolution and geology were no longer separate stories, they had merged into one. As reefs grew, so did the diversity of life around them. Different parts of the reef supported different communities. The outer edges, exposed to waves, were dominated by strong, flexible organisms that could hold fast against the current. Deeper within, the water was calmer, home to delicate species that relied on filtered light and gentle flow. Each niche had its specialists, all interdependent. The reef was a living machine, recycling nutrients and energy in perfect balance. Sponges played an important role in this system. They filtered vast amounts of water, capturing microscopic food while purifying the environment. Some formed symbiotic relationships with bacteria, sharing resources and stabilizing their chemistry. Others grew large and vase-shaped, towering over the seafloor like silent fountains. The waste they produced fed other creatures, creating small loops of energy within the larger ecosystem. Above the reefs, floating life continued its quiet revolution. Tiny plankton with mineralized skeletons drifted with the currents, rising and sinking with the sun's daily cycle. When they died, their bodies rained down like snow, forming thick layers of ooze that would one day harden into chalk and limestone. This steady accumulation built the raw material for future mountains. What began as microscopic architecture became planetary geology. The Ordovician Ocean, for all its alien beauty, was starting to look structurally familiar. Layers of producers, consumers, and decomposers formed stable systems. The balance of predators and prey created cycles that could endure disruption. Each creature, no matter how small, contributed to the building and rebuilding of the seafloor. Even death was part of construction. Skeletons became substrate for new life. Shells turned into sand, and reefs regenerated atop the ruins of their predecessors. If you could compress millions of years into minutes and watch the seafloor evolve, it would look like a living city in constant renovation. Colonies rising and falling, reefs growing and collapsing, coastlines shifting like breathing structures. The rhythm was slow but steady. Construction, erosion, renewal. Life had learned to shape its own landscape. The materials of this construction were surprisingly elegant. Calcium carbonate, the main ingredient in most shells, has two common forms: calcite and aragonite. Each behaves differently under pressure and temperature. The fact that so many creatures learn to use both forms suggests a kind of evolutionary experimentation, a search for the best design. Some shells were thin but flexible, others thick and heavy. Some absorbed minerals quickly, others slowly. The diversity of building styles mirrored the diversity of the builders. Over time, these materials would harden into rock, preserving the details of ancient lives. The fossil record of the Ordovician is one of the richest in all of Earth's history precisely because of this shift toward mineralized bodies. Every shell, every coral branch, every piece of skeletal debris became a time capsule. When we study them today, we see not just shapes, but behaviors. The grooves of feeding patterns, the marks of predators, the layers of growth that recorded environmental change. These fossils are the blueprints of early architecture, showing how life turned chemistry into form. In some regions, entire platforms of limestone several kilometers thick were built by the accumulation of these materials. The weight of all those shells and skeletons slowly pressed the lower layers into rock. Eventually, tectonic movement would lift those layers above sea level, turning ancient reefs into mountain ranges. The cliffs of Wales, the hills of China, the plains of North America, many of them began as Ordovician seabeds. What was once underwater cityscape became landscape. The builders of the sea ended up designing the continents. The most fascinating part of this transformation is how unconscious it was. No organism intended to build mountains. Each coral, each mollusk, each microscopic plankton cell was simply living, growing, feeding, reproducing. Yet together, their collective activity reshaped the world. It's a reminder of how small actions, multiplied over time, can alter a planet. The Ordovician Ocean was full of quiet labourers, and their work still defines the earth beneath our feet. The innovation of hard parts also changed the course of evolution in subtler ways. With shells came the possibility of greater variety in body plans. Some creatures developed spirals, others coils, still others layered shells that grew outward like petals. Form followed function, but it also followed chance. A mutation that made a shell slightly thicker or a curve slightly tighter might mean survival, and over generations those traits accumulated. The diversity of forms exploded. It wasn't just a biological revolution, it was an artistic one. And yet, even amid all this creativity, the ocean remained a dangerous place. Every advantage came with a cost. Shells offered protection but also weight, making movement slower. Building a skeleton required energy and access to minerals which could be scarce in certain regions. Some species that couldn't afford the cost found other strategies: speed, camouflage, or chemical defenses. Evolution, as always, balanced every gain with a challenge. In shallow lagoons where sunlight shimmered through clear water, you could have seen entire communities of these architects at work. Corals spreading across the bottom like a slow fire, brachiopods filtering particles from the current, crinoids waving arms in the gentle flow, sponges creating intricate towers of porous stone. Every surface was alive, every shadow inhabited. The sea was no longer just a medium, it was an environment shaped by its inhabitants. The stillness of those places was deceptive, because change was constant. Reefs expanded until they reached the limits of available light, then eroded. Storms broke sections apart, scattering fragments that would seed new colonies elsewhere. The process was both chaotic and organised, destruction feeding creation. Life had discovered not only how to build, but how to rebuild, an essential skill for survival on a restless planet. If we could stand on one of those reefs, we'd see that even the smallest crevice held activity. Worms built tubes of sand and mucus. Tiny crustaceans carried bits of debris to camouflage themselves. Early echinoderms, ancestors of starfish and sea urchins, clung to the coral with delicate spines. Every space was occupied, every resource used. The efficiency of the ecosystem was astonishing. Nothing went to waste. And still, above all this movement and construction, the tides continued their rhythm. The same rhythm that has persisted for nearly 500 million years. Water rising and falling, light shifting, waves breaking. The same lunar pull that shapes our coasts today shaped those ancient reefs. Time in the Ordovician was measured not by clocks or calendars, but by tides and sediment, by the slow growth of coral and the steady fall of shells. The architects of shell and stone built more than protection. They built permanence. For the first time, life left behind structures that would outlast it. Those reefs, those shells, those limestone beds, they endured long after their builders were gone. Even now, when you walk on certain cliffs or hold a piece of fossilized coral in your hand, you're touching their legacy. It's the architecture of endurance, the blueprint of survival written in mineral and patience. And somewhere, while all of this construction unfolded beneath the waves, the land waited. Wind swept across bare rock. Rain fell and carried minerals down to the sea. The same elements that built shells on the ocean floor were beginning to shape landscapes above it. The partnership between land and sea was deepening. The ocean was busy creating architects, but the land was quietly preparing its first tenants. Soon, those tenants would arrive. But for now, the reefs continued their patient expansion, and the architects of shell and stone kept building, unaware that their greatest legacy was yet to come. The moment when life would follow the minerals home, rising slowly from salt water to sunlight. The oceans of the Ordovician world were never still for long. Beneath the reefs and drifting plankton, the planet itself was in motion. The continents, enormous slabs of crust floating on molten rock, were slowly sliding across the globe, pushed and pulled by forces deep within the earth. To the creatures of the time, these movements were invisible. No trilobite could have sensed that the ground beneath it was shifting by centimetres each year. No coral could have guessed that the seabed it grew upon would one day rise into mountains. Yet the slow dance of the continents was shaping everything above them: the currents, the climate, the chemistry of the seas, and the future of life itself. The arrangement of the continents during the Ordovician looked nothing like our modern world. What we now call North America was then a tropical island continent known as Laurentia, ringed by warm, shallow seas where sunlight reached deep into the water. To its east lay Baltica, a smaller continent that would one day form parts of Europe. Between them stretched the vast Iapetus Ocean, a body of water that has long since vanished but once rivaled the Atlantic in size. Farther south, an enormous landmass called Gondwana dominated the planet, extending from the equator down to the South Pole. It contained what would become Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, and Australia. a supercontinent that would slowly drift toward colder latitudes as the period progressed. These continents did not move aimlessly. They were guided by convection currents in the mantle, the layer of hot, semi-fluid rock beneath the crust. As heat rose from the Earth's core, it caused slow circulation patterns that pushed the plates in different directions. Where plates moved apart, new ocean floor formed. Where they collided, one plate slid beneath another, creating mountain ranges and deep ocean trenches. Over millions of years, this movement recycled the crust, renewed the seabed, and rearranged the surface of the world. The slow collision of Laurentia, Baltica, and several smaller island chains during the Ordovician was particularly important. Their convergence began to close the Iapetus Ocean, creating subduction zones where the ocean floor sank into the mantle. Volcanic arcs rose along the edges of the continents, forming chains of islands and mountains that would eventually become parts of modern Scotland, Newfoundland, and Scandinavia. The underwater eruptions poured ash and minerals into the sea, enriching nearby ecosystems even as they caused local devastation. In those regions, life learned to recover quickly from disruption, an evolutionary skill that would prove valuable again and again. Every movement of the plates had consequences for the oceans above. When continents shifted position, they changed the shape of the seafloor, altering the paths of currents. Warm water flowed into new basins, cold water spilled from the poles, and circulation patterns rearranged themselves. These currents controlled the distribution of nutrients, oxygen, and temperature, the invisible framework that determined where life could thrive. A reef that once flourished in warm, stable water could suddenly find itself in cooler, nutrient-rich conditions, forcing its inhabitants to adapt or perish. The rising and falling of sea levels added another layer of complexity. The Ordovician was a time of high seas, with much of the continents flooded under shallow sunlit water known as epicontinental seas. These vast inland oceans were calm and warm, perfect nurseries for life. They connected coastlines that are now thousands of kilometers apart, creating networks where species could spread and diversify. But the same seas were sensitive to change. Even small shifts in temperature or ice formation at the poles could cause them to expand or retreat, exposing reefs and killing off shallow water organisms. In some regions, these fluctuations left behind alternating layers of limestone and shale, geological evidence of the ocean's pulse. Each limestone bed represented a time of high sea level and abundant carbonate production, when warm, clear water allowed reefs to flourish. Each shale layer marked a retreat, when sediment from the land washed in as sea levels dropped. Together, these layers form a record of the rhythmic rise and fall of the Ordovician seas, a record so regular that geologists today can read it like a slow heartbeat preserved in stone. That pulse was more than geological rhythm, it was biological tempo. The creatures of the time evolved to match it. Many species of trilobite, for example, synchronized their reproductive cycles with the tides and seasonal currents. When the water warmed, they migrated to shallow areas to spawn, leaving mass deposits of eggs that later fossilized in clusters. Corals grew most rapidly during stable sea levels, then paused during regressions when conditions became uncertain. The ocean's motion set the pace for every form of life within it, from microscopic plankton to massive nautiloids. This connection between plate movement and life extended beyond the seas themselves. The collisions of continents created new mountains, which in turn began to weather under wind and rain. That weathering released minerals into rivers, and those rivers carried nutrients to the ocean, fertilizing plankton blooms. The more the land eroded, the more the ocean was fed. The carbon cycle. The grand exchange between atmosphere, land and sea was in full operation, even if the players were primitive and the timescales incomprehensible. The cooling trend that began in the late Ordovician was tied to these very processes. As the continents drifted south and more land reached polar latitudes, glaciers began to form. Weathering of newly raised mountain ranges drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, further lowering temperatures, The ocean's chemistry responded in kind, with increased oxygen levels and shifting acidity. The biosphere was not just a passenger on these changes, it was a participant. Each shell that formed, each reef that grew, each mountain that eroded was part of the same slow, interwoven cycle. In this way, the Earth itself acted almost like a living organism. Its crust flexed and flowed, its oceans breathed in and out, and its atmosphere pulsed with chemical exchange. Life was both symptom and cause of this planetary metabolism. The creatures that built shells were feeding on nutrients from the land, which in turn came from the rocks that the ocean's own currents had shaped. It was a feedback system of extraordinary subtlety, one that operated not in minutes or years, but in eons. To the inhabitants of the Ordovician Sea, of course, none of this would have been apparent. A trilobite crawling across a coral shelf would have felt the gentle sway of the current and perhaps the faint tremor of distant undersea earthquakes. But it could not have imagined that those tremors were the sound of continents colliding, that the surface beneath its legs was being slowly folded into mountain ranges that would one day rise above the clouds. Even so, those movements were its destiny. Its descendants' fossils would be lifted high into the air, stranded far from the sea, only to be discovered millions of years later as reminders of a vanished ocean. When we look at the rocks from that time, we see evidence of these movements written in the smallest details. Fossilized shells tilted at odd angles, ancient coral beds folded into arches, seams of volcanic ash interwoven with limestone. Each layer is a page in the story of shifting plates and restless seas. Some layers show quiet stability, as when life flourished undisturbed. Others record catastrophe, sudden burial, ashfall, collapse. The alternation between the two tells us that the Earth's pulse was steady but not smooth. Like any living rhythm, it had its irregular beats, its moments of acceleration and pause. One of the most dramatic consequences of plate motion was the creation of new habitats. As continents drifted apart, they opened rift valleys that flooded with seawater, forming isolated basins. These basins became evolutionary laboratories where species could diverge and adapt to unique conditions. The isolation encouraged diversity, producing a mosaic of regional ecosystems rather than one global uniformity. A coral species that thrived in Laurentia might have close relatives in Baltica or Gondwana, but each was slightly different, shaped by local conditions. This pattern of separation and innovation became one of evolution's most powerful engines. Meanwhile, the ocean floor itself was renewing. New crust was forming at mid-ocean ridges, pushing older crust outward towards subduction zones. This process not only recycled the seafloor but also affected sea level. When spreading rates increased, the ridges swelled, displacing water and causing global sea levels to rise. When spreading slowed, sea levels fell. To the creatures in the shallows, this meant recurring cycles of expansion and retreat, long-term tides driven by geology rather than gravity. Each cycle tested the adaptability of life, weeding out the inflexible and rewarding the resilient. Volcanic activity too played its part in the planet's pulse. Every eruption released gases into the atmosphere, altering climate in both directions, cooling through ash clouds, warming through carbon dioxide. Volcanic islands provided new surfaces for colonization, while underwater eruptions created mineral-rich environments that fueled unique microbial communities. The ash that settled into the ocean became nutrient fertilizer, stimulating bursts of productivity. But too much ash could also smother reefs and poison waters. Life had to navigate this delicate balance, thriving in moderation but retreating from excess. Over time, the interactions between these geological and biological systems created feedback loops that stabilized the planet. When temperatures rose, weathering increased, pulling carbon from the air and cooling the climate. When temperatures dropped, weathering slowed, allowing carbon to accumulate again. It was a self-regulating system, imperfect but enduring. The Ordovician Earth was finding equilibrium, not a static balance, but a dynamic one, always shifting, always correcting. The evidence of these cycles is preserved even in the fossils themselves. The chemical composition of shells reveals changes in ocean temperature and chemistry. Oxygen isotopes trapped within calcium carbonate record the rhythm of climate swings. Strontium levels tell us about erosion rates and volcanic input. Each fossil is a tiny instrument, measuring the heartbeat of a planet. When scientists study them today, they can reconstruct not only what the creatures looked like, but what the water felt like, what the air contained, how the continents were moving. The story of life and the story of Earth's crust are one and the same, two sides of a single system in motion. It's easy to think of continents as immovable and oceans as eternal, but the Ordovician reminds us how transient they are. Seas come and go, land rises and sinks. What was once deep ocean becomes mountaintop. What was mountain crumbles into sand. To the Earth, 1,000,000 years is a heartbeat. The pulse of plate and sea is slow, but it never stops. If we could watch it all unfold in a single continuous film, we'd see the continents drifting like slow clouds, merging and breaking apart, the colours of the ocean changing as climate and chemistry shift. Reefs would grow, die and grow again. Volcanoes would rise, erupt and erode away. Glaciers would advance, retreat and melt. Through it all, life would adapt, not to one world, but to a world that was constantly reinventing itself. By the end of the Ordovician, the continents were drawing closer together, the global temperature had dropped, and glaciers were expanding across the southern reaches of Gondwana. Sea levels began to fall, exposing once submerged reefs and coastlines. For the creatures of the shallows, this was a slow disaster. Habitats shrinking, water retreating, temperatures dropping. Yet even in that hardship, evolution continued. Some species migrated to deeper waters, others developed new strategies to survive the cold. The Earth's pulse was not just geological anymore, it was biological, a heartbeat shared between planet and life. And as the continents continued their inexorable motion, they carried with them the seeds of what was to come. The tectonic collisions that built mountains would feed rivers that nourished oceans. The glaciations that cooled the world would pave the way for new climates and new ecosystems. The story of the Ordovician did not end with stillness or collapse. It ended with transformation. The planet setting the stage for another leap forward, another wave of creativity, another chapter in the long experiment of life. The sea's pulse slowed, the air grew colder, and the surface of the world began to change. Beneath the ice and shifting currents, life waited, adapting quietly, ready for what would follow. The architects of shell and stone had done their work well. The planet they had built was strong enough to endure its own heartbeat. And as the water cooled and the continent settled into new positions, the next part of the story was already beginning. The rise of new forms, new rhythms, and the first signs that life might soon touch the air above the tide. The Earth was cooling, the continents shifting, and the reefs of the Ordovician world rising and falling with the tides of time. Yet, for all the grandeur of continents colliding and oceans breathing, the real transformation was taking place on a smaller scale. It wasn't the towering nautiloids or the sprawling reefs that defined the heartbeat of this era. It was the tiny, drifting, multiplying multitude of small things. The plankton, the algae, the spores, and the invisible creatures that filled the water column like a fine mist of life. They were so small that a single drop of seawater contained thousands, each carrying out its own quiet task. Collectively, they orchestrated the chemistry of the planet, turning sunlight into sustenance, carbon into stone, and chaos into order. If the great reefs were the monuments of the Ordovician, these tiny beings were its engineers. Without them, the seas would have been barren, and the oxygen that filled the sky might never have reached breathable levels. The ocean was their stage, and the performance they gave was endless, a symphony conducted by sunlight, temperature, and time. It began near the surface, in the thin band of light where the sun's rays could still reach. Here, microscopic organisms floated and drifted, capturing photons and turning them into chemical energy. Cyanobacteria, descendants of even older lineages, continued their ancient work of photosynthesis, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Alongside them thrived new groups: green algae, red algae, and the first eukaryotic plankton, complex cells with nuclei and organelles. Their diversity exploded during the Ordovician, and with that explosion came stability. The ocean was learning to breathe deeply and evenly, the balance of gases and nutrients smoothing into rhythm. Every morning as sunlight warmed the surface, plankton rose toward it. They moved not by choice but through physics, buoyed upward as water layers stratified with heat. As the day cooled, they sank again, carrying with them the carbon they had captured. This vertical migration created a pump that slowly moved carbon from the surface to the deep sea. It was invisible, constant, and world-changing. The planet's first biological carbon pump was in motion, transforming climate regulation from a purely geological process into a biological one. The consequences were immense. Over millions of years, this slow, steady export of carbon lowered greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, cooling the planet even further. The same process that sustained life in the ocean was gradually setting the stage for the first great glaciation. It's one of the paradoxes of Earth's story. The smallest organisms created the conditions that nearly extinguished much of life. Yet, without their quiet industry, the air would never have become breathable, nor the world ready for the expansion of complex life to come. Beneath the surface, the products of their labour fell like snow. When plankton died, their shells and bodies drifted downward, collecting on the seafloor as fine sediment. Over time, this rain of microscopic debris formed layers of chalk and limestone that still exist today. In some regions, the thickness of these deposits reaches hundreds of meters, each grain a record of ancient sunlight. Even now, entire landscapes, white cliffs, pale hills, rolling plains, are built from the remains of these small things. They turned energy into matter, and matter into history. Among them were the graptolites, colonial planktonic animals that floated in the open ocean. Each colony consisted of many small individuals housed in a shared structure, a kind of organic skeleton that looked like a delicate saw blade or feathery ribbon. They drifted with the currents, feeding on even smaller particles, and their distribution across the seas made them perfect markers of time. Today, paleontologists use graptolites to date Ordovician rocks with precision. They were nature's timekeepers, their remains scattered like notches along the planet's geological clock. Closer to shore, another microscopic world thrived on sunlight and minerals washed from the continents. Diatom-like algae and other early phytoplankton formed thick blooms that coloured the water green. These blooms were not just biological phenomena, they were engines of transformation. As they multiplied, they consumed nutrients, altered oxygen levels, and sometimes triggered cascades of chemical change that rippled through entire ecosystems. When the blooms collapsed, the decay of so much organic matter could deplete oxygen, creating anoxic zones where few larger organisms could survive. The balance between productivity and suffocation was delicate, but over millions of years, it drove evolution to new levels of resilience. In the quiet shallows, microbial mats still held on, relics of a more ancient Earth. These layered communities of bacteria and algae formed films over rocks and sediment, trapping grains of sand and building structures called stromatolites. Though less dominant than they had been in earlier eras, they remained important players in the chemistry of the coastal zones. Their presence stabilised sediments, provided habitats for small invertebrates, and contributed to oxygen production. They were the foundation beneath the reefs, silent and steady. What makes these tiny organisms remarkable is not just their abundance, but their cooperation. In a single patch of water, hundreds of species interacted, some competing, others complementing each other. Algae produced oxygen that bacteria used to decompose waste. The decomposers in turn released nutrients that fed the algae. Zooplankton grazed on phytoplankton, keeping populations in check while fueling the next step in the food web. Every molecule of energy passed through countless hands before returning to the deep. The entire system was built on exchange. The larger animals of the Ordovician, trilobites, brachiopods, cephalopods, depended entirely on this microscopic foundation. Plankton fed the filter feeders, which in turn fed the predators. When plankton populations rose, the entire food chain prospered. When they fell, everything suffered. The reefs might have seemed like the centre of life, but in truth, the ocean's stability came from the surface, from the drifting clouds of invisible builders that turned sunlight into sustenance. If you could follow a single particle of carbon through this world, you'd see it move through many lives. It might begin in a ray of sunlight, captured by an algal cell. Then it could pass into a copepod's body, then into the shell of a brachiopod, then into sediment as waste, then into a bacterial cell, and finally back into the water as dissolved gas. The recycling was endless, an elegant loop of chemistry and biology intertwined. Nothing was wasted. Every molecule found use. This efficiency made the Ordovician Ocean extraordinarily productive. Fossil evidence suggests that primary productivity, the total amount of energy captured from sunlight, was higher than at almost any earlier time. The expansion of plankton and algae transformed the marine biosphere into a complex, self-sustaining system. It was no longer a collection of isolated species, but a network of interactions stretching from surface to sea floor. The ocean had become an integrated whole. But this new system also introduced vulnerability. The same processes that made the world stable could, under certain conditions, tip it into instability. When the balance between carbon burial and release shifted, global climate followed. When nutrient flows increased too much, oxygen levels dropped. When volcanic eruptions added iron and phosphorus to the water, plankton blooms surged and collapsed in quick succession. The symphony of small things could shift from harmony to dissonance without warning. Yet for the most part, the Ordovician Ocean thrived. The regular cycles of light and dark, warm and cool, bloom and decay kept the system in motion. It was this rhythm, the slow rise and fall of microscopic populations, that maintained equilibrium. Each bloom drew down carbon and produced oxygen. Each collapse recycled nutrients and reset the stage. The ocean was not static but dynamic, alive in every sense of the word. The air above was changing too. The oxygen released by marine photosynthesis began to accumulate in greater concentrations, reaching new highs in Earth's history. This shift altered the chemistry of the atmosphere, allowing ozone to form in the upper layers. That ozone shielded the surface from ultraviolet radiation, making it safer for life to eventually venture onto land. The small things, without intent or awareness, were laying the groundwork for one of evolution's greatest transitions. In some parts of the world, particularly near the equator, the proliferation of plankton also affected the colour of the ocean. The clear blue of earlier ages gave way to more varied shades. Green where blooms were dense, brownish where sediments mixed in, and even milky white in areas of intense carbonate precipitation. The planet was no longer a uniform sphere of water and rock. It was beginning to show character, pattern, and diversity. The seas were changing hue as life painted its presence onto the surface. When we look at Ordovician rocks today, we can still see the fingerprints of these tiny organisms. In thin sections under microscopes, geologists find microfossils, the minute shells of planktonic foraminifera, the skeletal fragments of algae, the imprints of bacterial films. Each grain tells a story of interaction, a frozen note from that ancient symphony. Some microfossils are so well preserved that their internal structures remain visible, a testament to how delicately the ocean recorded its own history. It's easy to overlook them. When we imagine prehistoric worlds, our minds go to the large and the dramatic, the towering cephalopods, the sprawling reefs, the eventual forests and dinosaurs. But the truth is that the world has always been run by the small. Even now, the majority of Earth's oxygen comes from plankton in the sea. The same quiet forces that shaped the Ordovician continue their work today, turning sunlight into air, recycling the waste of the living into the materials of the future. The symphony has never stopped playing. It has simply changed its key. If we could somehow drift through those Ordovician waters, seeing them with both the naked eye and a microscope at once, it would be like looking at two worlds superimposed. To the eye, a calm sea dotted with drifting nautiloids and soft coral shadows. To the microscope, a storm of motion, countless cells dividing, feeding, dying, merging, each scale of life unaware of the other, yet both essential. The macro and the micro intertwined in a balance so precise that even a small disruption could echo for millennia. The interactions between small and large life forms were not purely biological. They also changed the physics of the ocean itself. As plankton populations increased, they altered the density of surface waters, which affected circulation patterns. More organic matter sinking meant more oxygen consumed in the deep sea, leading to the creation of layered oceans, oxygen-rich above, oxygen-poor below. This stratification influenced where animals could live, where reefs could grow, and how nutrients were recycled. The invisible work of the smallest organisms controlled the architecture of the larger systems. Over time, this layering helped create the first stable deep ocean ecosystems. Bacteria that could survive without oxygen thrived in the darker anoxic zones, breaking down organic material in ways that produced methane and other gases. These microbes, in turn, supported other forms of life adapted to chemical energy rather than sunlight. The ocean was learning to sustain complexity at every depth, from the bright surface to the pitch-black trenches. In this balance of light and dark, of photosynthesis above and decomposition below, the planet reached a new kind of equilibrium. The carbon that the plankton pulled from the air was buried in sediments, while volcanic activity slowly released some back. Oxygen and carbon dioxide danced in opposition, their relative concentrations setting the planet's climate. It was a feedback loop so elegant that it kept Earth habitable through immense swings in temperature and geography. The symphony of small things was, in truth, the orchestra of stability. When the great ice sheets began to spread across Gondwana toward the end of the Ordovician, much of it was a consequence of this very stability, the culmination of millions of years of quiet efficiency. The small things had drawn down enough carbon to cool the world. They had, without intention, composed the overture to the first great mass extinction. Yet, even as ice advanced and seas retreated, the system endured. Some plankton adapted to colder water. Some shifted their range toward the equator. Others went dormant, waiting for warmth to return. Life, especially small life, was adaptable beyond measure. The oceans of the Ordovician might seem distant and alien, but they were the testing ground for every ecological principle that still governs the Earth today. Energy flow, nutrient cycling, feedback regulation, resilience. All of it began here in the drifting, multiplying clouds of small organisms that turned sunlight into order. Their collective hum filled the world, inaudible but constant. And as their work continued, as the light filtered through the upper waters and the deep grew dark with their remains, something else was beginning near the shorelines. Algae that had once lived entirely submerged were starting to linger a little longer above the waterline, their cells adapting to brief exposure to air. They were not yet plants, not yet terrestrial, but they were the bridge. The same tiny architects that managed the chemistry of the ocean were now experimenting with the chemistry of land. The small things had conquered the sea. The next movement in their symphony would be written in sunlight, soil, and the faint breath of a new kind of air. The Ordovician Ocean was full of movement, but not all of it was gentle. For hundreds of millions of years, life had been soft and slow, drifting or crawling, feeding passively on what currents provided. Now, something different was emerging. Predators were becoming more efficient, more deliberate and more complex. The seas were learning to hunt. Predation had existed since the dawn of multicellular life, but during the Ordovician, it took on a new scale. Creatures developed stronger limbs, sharper appendages, better senses, and more coordinated behaviours. The ocean was no longer a place where survival depended only on filtering or hiding. It became a landscape of pursuit and defence, of strategy and adaptation. The result was a surge in diversity, as prey and predator pushed each other to evolve. Among the most visible of these new hunters were the nautiloids. They were cephalopods, distant ancestors of squids and octopuses, enclosed in shells that could be straight, curved, or coiled. Some were small enough to fit in a hand, others stretched several meters in length, their long bodies tapering into sleek cones. They moved through the water by jet propulsion, drawing water into a chamber and expelling it through a funnel-like siphon. The precision of their movement was remarkable. They could hover, drift, or dart forward in bursts, controlling direction with fine adjustments of their tentacles and shell orientation. At the front of each nautiloid was a ring of tentacles surrounding a beak-like mouth. They were not fast by modern standards, but in the context of their world they were apex predators. They hunted trilobites, small mollusks, and anything soft-bodied and slow enough to be caught. Their eyes, though primitive, could detect contrast and movement, enough to locate prey in the dim underwater light. When they struck, they used both force and suction, pulling victims toward the beak and breaking through shell or exoskeleton with crushing power. The presence of such predators changed everything. Creatures that had once lived openly on the seabed began to hide. Trilobites burrowed more deeply or evolved spines for protection. Brachiopods anchored themselves in tighter crevices. Some developed thicker shells, others developed the ability to roll up completely, sealing themselves against attack. Even simple worms began to dig deeper tunnels, carving networks through the sediment that served as refuge from the hunters above. Evolution was no longer just about growth and reproduction, it was about defense and awareness. For the smaller creatures of the reefs, survival depended on quick reactions. Starfish, then still relatively new on the evolutionary stage, became skilled opportunists. They moved slowly, but their ability to pry open shells and feed on soft tissue made them dangerous to stationary prey. Crinoids, the so-called sea lilies, responded by growing taller, lifting their delicate feeding arms farther from the reach of ground-dwelling predators. In this way, the vertical dimension of the ocean became more important. Life was spreading not just outward but upward, filling every available layer of space. The reefs themselves became arenas of constant interaction. Tiny crustaceans scurried across coral branches, scavenging bits of organic material. Small mollusks grazed on algae films. Predators followed them into the nooks and crannies, probing with limbs or tentacles to extract prey. The complexity of these microhabitats fostered specialization. Each species found a particular niche, a depth, a feeding method, a hiding place, and refined it. Diversity multiplied not because of stability but because of competition. The arms of the ocean reached everywhere, and everything had to adapt to their touch. At the same time, predation led to the evolution of sensory systems. Animals began to respond not just to touch or light, but to chemical signals in the water. The faint trail of a wounded animal, the subtle vibrations of movement, the pressure changes caused by approaching bodies, all became part of the sensory landscape. This invisible web of signals made the Ordovician Ocean alive in new ways. Each movement carried information, and each organism learned in its own limited way how to read it. For the nautiloids and other active hunters, this meant a form of awareness, Not intelligence as we understand it, but a growing sensitivity to the environment. The world was no longer random. It had patterns, cues, and consequences. For prey, it meant vigilance. For predators, it meant strategy. The dynamic between them became a cycle that would echo throughout the rest of evolution. Awareness driving adaptation, adaptation driving complexity. The arms of the ocean were not only tentacles and limbs, but also the metaphorical reach of evolution itself. Every new adaptation created space for another. When predators learned to crush shells, prey developed harder minerals. When burrowing became common, oxygen levels in the sediment increased, allowing new species of bacteria to flourish. When reef organisms grew upward for safety, they created habitats for others. Each action propagated through the system like ripples. Life was engineering itself in response to its own challenges. Fossils from this time record evidence of these struggles. Some trilobite shells show healed bite marks. Scars from attacks survived. Others show clean punctures, the fatal work of predators. The arrangement of coral fragments in certain layers suggests that they were broken by disturbances rather than by slow decay. Even the patterns of burrows and feeding traces tell stories of tension, retreat, and pursuit. The seafloor of the Ordovician was not a static plane. It was a battlefield written in slow motion. But it was a beautiful battlefield. Predation, though destructive, brought balance and innovation. It prevented dominance by any single group and encouraged diversification. The arms race between predator and prey led to the invention of shells, spines, speed, and stealth. In a sense, predation was the engine of creativity. Without it, ecosystems stagnate. With it, they evolve. The Ordovician proved that life's complexity is born from conflict as much as cooperation. Some of the most curious creatures of this era were neither pure predators nor pure prey, but opportunists, scavengers and filter feeders that took advantage of whatever the sea provided. They included early arthropods that filtered organic particles through appendages, and echinoderms that could shift between feeding modes depending on conditions. These flexible species acted as stabilizers, absorbing fluctuations in the food web. They ensured that no energy source went unused, keeping the ecosystem resilient even during disturbances. The balance extended beyond biology into chemistry. Predation and scavenging stirred up sediments, releasing nutrients that fed plankton blooms. Those blooms in turn fed the entire food chain, including the predators that started the process. It was a closed loop. Destruction feeding creation, hunger maintaining balance. The arms of the ocean moved not only through bodies, but through cycles of matter and energy. If we could observe the water itself, we'd see that it moved in ways shaped by these interactions. Near the reefs, currents were funneled and accelerated by coral structures, creating eddies where plankton collected. In open waters, the movement of larger animals mixed layers of temperature and oxygen. Even the passage of a single large nautiloid could stir the microcurrents enough to redistribute particles. The physical and biological motions intertwined so deeply that they became indistinguishable. The ocean was alive not only with creatures but with their consequences. The rise of predators also changed the tempo of reproduction. Species with shorter lifespans or higher fecundity had an advantage in a dangerous world. Many Ordovician organisms began producing vast numbers of offspring, ensuring that at least some would survive. This reproductive pressure accelerated evolution, increasing genetic variation and adaptability. The more danger there was, the faster life innovated. Still, the predators of this time were not the apex hunters we imagine today. They lacked the speed and intelligence of later fish, the coordination of sharks, or the cunning of octopuses, but they were pioneers. Their presence rewrote the rules of the ocean. Before them, life had been content to exist. After them, it had to compete. They brought tension to the ecosystem, and tension brought progress. In the shallower zones where sunlight penetrated and reefs thrived, this evolutionary contest was particularly intense. There, trilobites were abundant, each species adapted to specific conditions. Some had eyes designed for the shifting light of shallow water, others for the dim glow of the deep. Their vision, made possible by calcite lenses, was among the most advanced of its time. They could detect predators and navigate terrain with surprising precision. Vision itself became an evolutionary weapon, and once life began to see, the dynamics of survival changed forever. In deeper water, where light faded to green and then to black, the arms of the ocean took on other forms. There, soft-bodied predators relied on touch and chemical detection rather than sight. They moved through the darkness like living sensors, responding to vibration and flow. Prey animals in these regions often developed bioluminescence, using light not to see but to confuse or deter attackers. Even the deep, quiet zones were alive with interaction, a constant conversation of light, movement, and signal. These unseen worlds remind us that evolution is not only about competition but about information, how life perceives and responds to its surroundings. The rise of active predation made information valuable. Those who could detect danger earlier or interpret it more accurately survived. Those who couldn't vanished. The result was a steady increase in complexity, not just of form but of behaviour. Above the reefs, nautiloids drifted like sentinels. Their shells, filled with gas chambers for buoyancy, allowed them to hover effortlessly. They patrolled the water columns, their tentacles spreading like searching instruments. Around them, schools of smaller animals swam in coordinated patterns, a defensive response that hinted at the beginnings of social behaviour. Even in this early age, cooperation was appearing as an answer to predation. If we imagine the sound of the ocean then, if such sound could reach us, it would not have been silent. The clicking of shells, the faint rasp of limbs against rock, the soft pulse of jet propulsion. Life was communicating through touch and vibration long before it could speak. The arms of the ocean were both literal and metaphorical, tentacles, currents, signals, and consequences stretching across the marine world. All of this movement and interaction created a form of stability through complexity. When ecosystems become intricate, they can absorb disruption more effectively. A predator taking one prey species too far down might unintentionally create opportunities for others. The web adjusts, shifts, and finds a new balance. In this way, the Ordovician Ocean became one of the first examples of self-regulating ecology. It was chaotic in detail but stable in the long term, a dance of survival that kept everything in motion. As the period progressed, the predators grew larger and more specialised. The top of the food web became crowded with competition. Some nautiloids evolved to hunt in open water, others stayed near the coast. New forms of arthropods developed grasping limbs and armoured plating. The diversity of shapes and strategies expanded until nearly every ecological niche in the sea had a player. The world had never been so alive, nor so interdependent. But even this flourishing carried the seed of change. The cooling climate, the shifting continents, and the gradual drawdown of carbon dioxide were setting the stage for upheaval. As glaciers advanced across Gondwana, sea levels would begin to drop, compressing habitats and driving new pressures. The arms of the ocean, so recently extended in abundance, would soon feel the strain of contraction. Yet for now, the seas remained full, the predators restless, the reefs alive. In the depths, a nautiloid drifted past a slope of coral, its shadow passing over trilobites that froze at its approach. Above, sunlight shimmered through layers of plankton. The water was thick with life, and every motion carried consequence. The ocean had grown arms, and with them, awareness. Soon, those arms would reach even farther, not just through the water but toward the edges of the sea, where the first algae were beginning to cling more confidently to rock. The arms of the ocean were stretching toward the land, preparing the way for life to follow. The reefs of the Ordovician seas had been growing for millions of years, each one a slow and steady masterpiece built from the labour of countless small creatures. They were not coral reefs in the modern sense, not the brightly coloured structures filled with tropical fish that we might imagine today, but their function was the same. They were the backbone of biodiversity, the architecture of life beneath the waves. Each reef was a living city, built layer by layer by tiny, tireless workers, then inherited by generations that built further upon its foundation. If you could have drifted over one of these ancient structures, you would have seen a landscape of extraordinary variety. Mounds and ridges of coral, sponges and algae rose from the seafloor like underwater hills. Between them, channels of clear water carried nutrients, and sunlight filtered down through the surface in bright ribbons. Every surface, every crevice, every shadow was occupied. The reefs were alive not just with the organisms that built them, but with the communities that depended on them. Corals, though small and individually fragile, were powerful in their collective effort. Each one built a cup of calcium carbonate around itself, anchoring to rock or to the skeletons of earlier generations. As they died, their remains became the foundation for new colonies. Over time, this layering produced massive structures, thick, solid frameworks that could withstand waves and currents. The living corals grew only on the outermost surface, feeding on plankton caught by their tentacles, while the dead layers below served as scaffolding. The result was a self-sustaining structure, alive on the outside, ancient within. Alongside the corals were stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that also built rigid skeletons. Their smooth surfaces filled the gaps between coral branches, strengthening the reef's frame. Together, corals and stromatoporoids formed partnerships that created stability. The reefs were not accidental collections of species. They were organised, cooperative systems, though no individual intended cooperation. Each creature simply followed its instinct, and the result was balance. The reefs became homes for a multitude of other beings. Crinoids anchored themselves to the coral skeletons, spreading their arms to catch drifting food. Small mollusks grazed on algae that grew in patches of sunlight. Trilobites crawled along the sandy channels between coral ridges, feeding on organic debris. Worms burrowed into the reef's base, recycling waste into nutrients. Every layer of the structure supported a different community. Near the top, where light was strongest, the reef buzzed with activity. Deeper down, in the cooler and darker zones, the pace was slower, but life persisted. The entire ecosystem functioned like a vast, slow heartbeat, energy flowing from the sunlit surface down into the quiet depths. For millions of years, these coral cities expanded. They followed coastlines, spread across continental shelves, and formed barriers that shaped ocean currents. Some reefs stretched for hundreds of kilometres, dividing seas into separate basins. Behind these natural walls, calmer lagoons formed, rich in plankton and fine sediment. These sheltered areas became nurseries for young animals, places of relative safety in a world full of predators. The reefs didn't just host life, they created new habitats where life could grow. The diversity within these ecosystems was astonishing. In some fossilized reefs, paleontologists have identified hundreds of species living side by side, each adapted to its specific niche. There were sponges filtering water through their porous bodies, bryozoans constructing delicate colonies that looked like lace, echinoderms extending arms into the current, and brachiopods clinging to the surfaces like clusters of tiny shells. Each species depended on the stability of the others. When corals grew too quickly, they could block light or smother neighbours. When storms broke parts of the reef, new surfaces opened up for colonisation. Destruction and growth were part of the same rhythm. The chemistry of the reefs also shaped the ocean around them. The corals extracted calcium carbonate from seawater, and in doing so influenced the balance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Every reef was a small climate machine, locking away carbon in stone. Over millions of years, their collective effect helped cool the planet. In this way, the reefs were both ecosystems and environmental regulators, living organisms altering the global balance of heat and gas. If you could touch the surface of one of these reefs, you'd feel that it was alive but solid, both fragile and enduring. The living layer was thin, perhaps only a few centimetres deep, but beneath it lay meters of compacted skeletons, each generation resting on the remains of the last. The texture was rough, filled with ridges and tiny pits where small creatures took shelter. The reef's surface changed daily, with algae growing in new spots, corals branching outward, and sediment settling in cracks. It was never finished, never still. The reef was a work in progress, millions of years long, and yet, for all their strength, the reefs were vulnerable. They depended on clear, sunlit water and stable conditions. When volcanic eruptions clouded the ocean with ash, or when sea levels changed rapidly, reefs could die off. Entire regions might lose their coral cover, leaving behind bare limestone skeletons. But as soon as the water cleared, new colonies began to grow. Life was persistent. It used every opportunity to rebuild. The quiet spaces within the reefs, the crevices, tunnels, and shaded alcoves, were as important as the living surface. These hidden areas hosted a different kind of life. Tiny crustaceans scuttled through the darkness, feeding on detritus. Worms burrowed through the porous rock, keeping it from becoming clogged with waste. Even bacteria played a role, breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients into forms that other organisms could use. The health of the reef depended on these unseen workers as much as on the corals themselves. The balance between construction and erosion was delicate. Wave action constantly wore away at the reef's surface, breaking pieces free. Those fragments settled nearby, forming new mounds that could become the foundation for future growth. In this way, the reef reproduced not just biologically but architecturally. Each fragment was both ruin and seed. Over geological time, entire landscapes of interconnected reefs formed, their shapes moulded by currents and tides. The reefs also served as natural barriers against storms. When waves crashed against them, the energy dissipated, protecting the lagoons and coastal plains behind. This protection allowed fine sediments to accumulate in those quieter waters, creating fertile zones where other forms of life could thrive. In a sense, the reefs acted as both shield and shelter. Their existence made the surrounding world gentler. Above these bustling ecosystems, the open water was dominated by plankton and drifting animals. The sunlight shimmering through the surface connected the two worlds, the floating and the fixed. Organic material produced in the upper layers rained down as marine snow, feeding the creatures below. In return, the reefs filtered the water, stabilizing its chemistry and clarity. The connection between light and stone, between movement and structure, was complete. Some parts of the Ordovician Ocean were almost entirely shaped by these coral frameworks. Vast carbonate platforms stretched across tropical regions, forming continuous belts of reef-building activity. The water above them was shallow and warm, perfect for photosynthesis. The clarity of these seas was remarkable. Sunlight penetrated deep enough for life to flourish even tens of meters below the surface. The visibility gave the reefs their direction, literally guiding their growth upward toward the light. The creatures that inhabited these coral cities were not aware of their dependence on one another, yet the relationships they formed were complex. Symbiotic partnerships, like those between corals and algae, had begun to emerge. The algae lived within coral tissues, sharing the products of photosynthesis in exchange for protection and nutrients. This cooperation allowed corals to grow faster and build stronger skeletons. It was one of the earliest examples of symbiosis shaping large-scale ecosystems, a principle that would continue to define life on Earth. For the smaller residents of the reef, the structure offered both opportunity and risk. Shelter was abundant, but so were predators. Small trilobites scurried through narrow crevices, their armoured plates scraping against coral as they searched for food. Worms extended delicate feeding threads into the current, retracting them instantly when shadows passed overhead. Starfish prowled across the surfaces, their tube feet gripping the stone with quiet strength. Everything was connected, and every movement carried consequence. Fossil evidence suggests that some reefs were home to thousands of individuals per square metre. The density of life was extraordinary. In these communities, energy moved rapidly from one level to another. Organic matter produced by algae and plankton was consumed by filter feeders, which in turn were eaten by larger animals. Waste material was broken down and reused. The system was closed, efficient, and resilient. It could absorb shocks, recover from damage, and continue its slow growth almost indefinitely. The reefs also recorded the passage of time in their own structure. As corals grew, they left behind growth bands, subtle variations in density that reflected changes in temperature, light, and chemistry. When scientists study fossil reefs today, they can read these bands like tree rings, reconstructing ancient climates and seasonal patterns. The coral cities were not just homes, they were archives. Each layer held a record of its world, written not in words but in mineral. The quiet kingdoms that surrounded the reefs extended far beyond their boundaries. Sediments carried by currents settled in nearby basins, creating soft, silty plains inhabited by different communities. Here, life moved more slowly. Crinoids, brachiopods, and worms dominated the scene. The water was murkier, the light dimmer, but the rhythm of life continued. These quieter regions were connected to the reefs by nutrient flow. The waste of one became the resource of another. Together they formed a gradient from vibrant metropolis to tranquil countryside, each dependent on the other's existence. The stability of these systems gave life the chance to refine itself. With reliable food sources and protected environments, organisms could specialize. Some corals developed elaborate branching forms to capture more light. Sponges diversified into new shapes and textures. Filter feeders evolved more efficient ways to extract nutrients from water. Evolution became a process of refinement rather than survival alone. For a long stretch of the Ordovician, these coral cities and quiet kingdoms represented one of the most successful experiments in Earth's history. They covered vast areas of the seafloor, supported immense biodiversity, and maintained ecological stability for tens of millions of years. In a world without land plants, without forests or soil, the reefs were the planet's most complex ecosystems. They were the first true communities of interdependent life, not just collections of species, but systems of relationships that created something larger than the sum of their parts. And then, slowly the balance began to shift. The continents moved, climates cooled, and sea levels fell. The reefs that had flourished in warm, shallow seas found themselves exposed to air or submerged in colder, darker water. The quiet kingdoms began to empty, the coral cities to crumble. The same forces that had built these wonders, the chemistry of the ocean, the movement of the plates, the pulse of the climate, now began to undo them. But even as they declined, their legacy endured. The reefs left behind thick layers of limestone, which would later form the foundations of continents. Their chemistry altered the atmosphere, paving the way for future life. Their ecosystems provided the blueprint for all that came after. The tropical reefs of later eras, the forests on land, the communities that humans would one day build. The coral cities and quiet kingdoms of the Ordovician were the first demonstration of nature's ability to construct complexity from cooperation, and in their slow, steady labour, they prepared the Earth for its next transformation, the moment when the boundaries of water would no longer be enough to contain life's ambition. For hundreds of millions of years, life had known only the sea. Every breath, every movement, every adaptation had taken place within water's soft weight. The reefs, the plankton, the nautiloids, the trilobites, all were children of the ocean, shaped by its chemistry and comfort. But near the end of the Ordovician, something subtle began to change. the boundaries of water, once absolute, were beginning to blur. Life was taking its first quiet steps toward the land. The process was not dramatic. There was no single creature crawling from the tide to claim the dry world. It began instead with something simple, almost unnoticeable: algae spreading across wet rock. These were the same kinds of organisms that had long carpeted the sea floor and formed mats in shallow water. Over time, some began to tolerate brief exposure to air. When the tide retreated or waves splashed higher onto stone, a few survived the dryness long enough to photosynthesize in the sunlight. It was a small adjustment, but in evolutionary terms, small adjustments are everything. The edges of ancient coastlines were dynamic places. Tides rose and fell, winds shifted, and spray coated the rocks with salt and moisture. Pools formed in crevices, trapped when the sea pulled back. In these pools, conditions changed rapidly. Temperature, salinity, and oxygen all fluctuated. For most marine life, these changes were lethal. But for certain algae and microbes, they were opportunities. The ability to withstand variability became a survival trait, and with each generation, those that endured just a little longer out of water left more descendants. The land itself, at this time, was barren. There were no plants, no soil, no insects. The continents were mostly rock and sand, shaped by wind and erosion. When rain fell, it carved channels that led back to the sea, carrying minerals that fed marine ecosystems. The colour palette of the planet was muted: greys, browns, and the pale blues of shallow water. Yet along those coastlines, the first stains of green began to appear. Thin films of algae coated damp surfaces, catching sunlight directly instead of through a layer of water. These were the first photosynthetic organisms to truly touch the land. It's difficult to overstate what this moment represented. For billions of years, water had been life's only refuge, the medium that allowed cells to exist and interact. To leave it, even briefly, meant confronting an entirely new set of challenges: desiccation, temperature swings, ultraviolet radiation, gravity. The algae that ventured onto wet rock had no protection from drying out, no structure to support themselves, no way to retain moisture. But those that survived the longest began to develop simple adaptations: thicker cell walls, mucus coatings, and filaments that could trap water. Some grew low to the ground, forming mats that protected their own lower layers from the sun. These early colonizers did not live independently of the sea. They were still bound to tides and spray. But their presence marked the beginning of a gradual shift. The boundary between marine and terrestrial life was no longer a sharp line but a gradient, a continuum of moisture where both could coexist. In these liminal spaces, evolution found new possibilities. While algae were the pioneers, other forms of microbial life followed. Cyanobacteria, which had already shaped Earth's atmosphere through photosynthesis, spread into damp environments along riverbanks and tidal flats. They formed biofilms that stabilized sediment, reducing erosion and helping retain water. These films acted as the first primitive soils, trapping organic material and minerals. Over time, they created microhabitats that could support other organisms: small invertebrates, spores, and bacteria that fed on decaying matter. The land was beginning to host a biological community, even if it was microscopic and fragile. This slow colonization of the shoreline had enormous implications. By binding sediments and retaining moisture, microbial mats altered how the land interacted with air and water. Rain that once ran quickly back to the ocean now lingered longer in surface layers. Evaporation slowed. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolved into these films and was fixed into organic material. The chemistry of the continents was changing, setting the stage for deeper transformations to come. Back in the ocean, these changes were felt too. Rivers began carrying slightly different loads of minerals into the sea. Nutrient flows shifted. The balance of elements that supported plankton and reef life was subtly adjusted. It was the start of a dialogue between land and ocean, an exchange of materials and energy that would one day define Earth's biosphere. At the same time, some aquatic plants began to develop more complex reproductive strategies. Many algae released spores or gametes into the water, letting currents carry them to new locations. But in the unstable environment of the shore, this approach was risky. Currents could sweep reproductive cells away before they found suitable conditions. Over time, some algae evolved to produce protective coverings around their reproductive stages, allowing them to survive temporary exposure to air. This innovation, though simple, was crucial. It was the first step toward the idea of the seed, the concept that life could persist through dryness and distance, waiting for the return of water. As land and sea grew more intertwined, the climate continued to shift. The drawdown of carbon dioxide by marine organisms and weathering processes had cooled the planet. Glaciers advanced across the southern continents, locking up water and lowering sea levels. The shallow seas that had once covered vast regions began to retreat. In many areas, the exposed seafloor became tidal flats, wide flat expanses where the ocean's edge moved back and forth each day. These were challenging environments, but they offered new opportunities for life to adapt. In these flats, thin crusts of microbial life took hold, stabilizing the surface. As tides moved in and out, they carried with them organic material and small creatures. Some animals, like certain burrowing worms and arthropods, learned to tolerate short periods of exposure to air. Their burrows remained moist even when the water receded, providing temporary refuge. These behaviours, accidental at first, were the beginnings of a pattern that would later define the colonisation of land. It's important to understand that evolution does not plan ahead. The algae on the rocks and the worms in the mud were not striving for a terrestrial future. They were simply responding to their circumstances. The fact that their adaptations would one day allow plants and animals to thrive on land was a consequence, not a goal. Yet, looking back, it's impossible not to see purpose in it. The slow, inevitable unfolding of potential. The sunlight that struck those ancient coastlines was the same sunlight that falls on modern shores. But to the organisms of the Ordovician, it was something new, a force to be harnessed more directly. In water, light scatters and fades with depth. On land, it is pure and unfiltered. The energy available on the surface was far greater than anything life had yet used. The algae that learned to survive in air, even briefly, were tapping into a source of power that would fuel all future ecosystems. The step toward the sun was also the step toward abundance. As oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose, conditions on land became more favourable. Ozone formed in the upper layers, creating a shield against harmful ultraviolet radiation. This protection allowed photosynthetic organisms to endure longer periods out of water. Each generation that survived a little longer on dry surfaces reinforced the adaptation. Gradually, the world began to green, faintly, tentatively, but unmistakably. The appearance of life on land also altered the physical landscape. Algal mats and microbial crusts began to darken the surface, reducing reflectivity and changing how the planet absorbed heat. They trapped dust and spores, creating patches of organic rich material. Over time, these patches grew deeper and more complex, giving rise to the first rudimentary soils. These soils in turn supported more microbial activity, accelerating the cycle. The continents, once inert, were beginning to breathe. Meanwhile, the sea continued its own transformations. Reefs flourished where conditions allowed, even as ice expanded elsewhere. The retreat of shorelines created new coastal habitats for colonization. The boundary between land and ocean became a living frontier, constantly shifting, constantly renewing. For every reef that perished beneath advancing ice, a new strip of coastline opened elsewhere, waiting for life to explore it. In the fossil record, traces of this transition are faint but unmistakable. Ancient rocks show impressions of microbial mats on once wet surfaces, preserved as wrinkled textures and fine ridges. These structures, called microbially induced sedimentary structures, are the footprints of early land life. They tell us that by the end of the Ordovician, the edge of the sea was no longer sterile. The first ecosystems had begun to extend beyond the tide. It would be millions of years before true plants appeared, with roots and stems capable of supporting themselves on dry land. But the groundwork was laid here. The chemistry of the continents had changed, the atmosphere was ready, and the evolutionary tools were in place. The step toward the sun had begun. In many ways, this transition reflected the broader pattern of the Ordovician, life responding to environmental change by creating new possibilities. As the planet cooled and seas contracted, the competition within the ocean intensified. Species sought new spaces, and the only direction left was upward, toward air and light. The pioneers of this shift were not aware of their significance, yet their quiet resilience reshaped the world. Imagine standing at the edge of an Ordovician sea, if that were somehow possible. The air would be thin, the wind sharp, carrying the scent of salt and minerals. The rocks beneath your feet would glisten with moisture, and here and there, a faint green sheen would catch the sunlight. At first glance, it might seem lifeless, but if you looked closer, you'd see films of algae spreading over the surface, tiny droplets of water trapped between their cells. In the shallow pools, simple creatures moved, small worms, early arthropods, fragments of the ocean's endless variety. It would be a world on the brink of transformation, the moment before a planet learned how to bloom. The sea would still dominate, its surface stretching to the horizon. Yet now, its influence was reaching farther than ever before. Through tides, through air, through the fragile films of moisture on stone, the ocean was extending its touch onto the land. Life was not escaping the sea, it was expanding it. The boundary between blue and brown, between liquid and solid, was dissolving. The earth was learning to be alive everywhere, and as those first green films thickened and darkened, absorbing more sunlight, the feedback loop continued. More photosynthesis meant more oxygen. More oxygen meant greater protection from radiation. Each generation made the world slightly easier for the next. Evolution was no longer just about survival within the ocean's limits. It was about exploration, about testing where life could exist and still endure. The step toward the sun was slow, almost imperceptible, but unstoppable. Once begun, it would continue for hundreds of millions of years, culminating in forests, animals, and entire ecosystems above the tide. But its origins lay here, in the quiet persistence of algae and microbes clinging to wet stone. The first green on land was not a revolution, it was a whisper. Yet that whisper would eventually change the colour of the earth itself. The earth had been restless for so long. Continents drifted, oceans opened and closed, volcanoes breathed out gas and ash, and glaciers crept across the land. Yet by the middle and later stages of the Ordovician, the planet was beginning to settle into a new kind of rhythm, not stillness, but regularity. The cycles of carbon, oxygen, temperature, and sea level, all of which had once fluctuated wildly, were finding a steady pattern. It was as if the planet itself had taken a deep breath and begun to exhale in time with its own biology. The forces that shaped this rhythm were both geological and biological, inseparable in their influence. On one side, the drifting of continents and the activity of volcanoes continued to sculpt the Earth's surface, setting the stage for climate and ocean currents. On the other, the vast communities of microscopic organisms and coral builders were regulating the composition of the air and water. The interaction between these two systems, the slow mechanics of rock and the fast chemistry of life, was creating a balance that had never existed before. The Earth's carbon cycle was central to this newfound stability. Carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere through volcanic eruptions and the breakdown of rocks, and it was drawn back out by weathering, photosynthesis, and the burial of organic material. In earlier eras, this exchange had been chaotic, with abrupt shifts that made the planet alternately hot and cold. But during the Ordovician, life began to take control of the process. Plankton and algae absorbed carbon during photosynthesis, and when they died, much of that carbon was carried to the seafloor and buried. The result was a slow, natural removal of greenhouse gases, a planetary thermostat managed by living things. This process did not create perfect balance. There were still fluctuations, warm periods when seas expanded, cold ones when ice advanced. But these cycles became more predictable. The average global temperature cooled slightly, oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose, and the distribution of life followed the rhythm of these changes. The Earth had entered a phase of cooperation between its physical and biological systems. It was not conscious, of course, but it functioned as though it were adjusting, responding, compensating. The ocean was where this rhythm was most visible. Every day, light and darkness governed the movements of plankton. Every season, temperature shifts altered currents and nutrient flows. Over longer intervals, sea levels rose and fell in response to glacial cycles. Each of these patterns influenced the others, creating nested rhythms, short, medium, and long. Together they made the Ordovician Ocean a world of constant motion but enduring stability. In the shallower seas, reefs grew and eroded in step with these changes. When sea levels were high and the water warm, corals flourished, building thick frameworks that teemed with life. When levels dropped or temperatures cooled, the reefs paused their growth or died back, only to recover when conditions improved. This cycle of expansion and contraction left behind alternating layers of limestone and shale, the geological fingerprints of the planet's breathing. The intervals between these layers recorded millions of years, yet the pattern was regular enough to be recognized even today. Above the ocean, the air was changing too. The rise in oxygen levels created an atmosphere that would have been breathable for modern animals, though none yet existed to take advantage of it. The sky, likely clearer and deeper in colour than today, reflected the purity of that air. With more oxygen came more ozone in the upper atmosphere, and that ozone absorbed ultraviolet light. For the first time in Earth's history, the surface of the land was protected from the most damaging radiation. It was as though the planet had developed a kind of skin, thin, invisible, but essential. The increased oxygen also had effects underwater. In the shallow seas, oxygen levels remained high, supporting complex communities. In deeper regions where circulation was slower, oxygen could still become scarce, leading to periodic anoxic events. These patterns created natural zoning in the ocean. Bright, oxygen-rich shallows full of coral and fish-like swimmers, and darker depths where only specialized organisms could survive. This stratification made the oceans more efficient in recycling nutrients. The upper layers produced, the lower layers decomposed, and the cycle continued. As the planet cooled, another kind of rhythm emerged, the glacial cycle. Ice began to accumulate at the poles, especially across the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. At first, the glaciers were small and local, but over time they grew into vast ice sheets that advanced and retreated in long pulses. Each pulse caused sea levels to fall and rise again, reshaping coastlines and marine habitats. The changes were slow on a human timescale, but dramatic over millions of years. Entire reef systems could be drowned or exposed, ecosystems destroyed and reformed. Yet through it all, life endured, adapting to the cadence of expansion and retreat. The ice reflected sunlight back into space, reinforcing cooling. As the climate grew colder, the contrast between equator and pole intensified, driving stronger ocean currents. These currents mixed water layers and distributed nutrients around the globe, sustaining productivity even during cooler phases. The interaction between climate, circulation and biology created feedback loops that kept the Earth habitable. The planet was finding not a single equilibrium, but a dynamic one, a balance achieved through constant change. This idea of dynamic stability is one of the most profound lessons from the Ordovician world. The planet was not balanced because it was still, but because it was active. Every process, erosion, sedimentation, photosynthesis, decay, was part of a continuous exchange. The sea took from the air and the land gave back through rivers and weathering. The air responded by adjusting temperature and composition. The result was a planet that could maintain life not by resisting change, but by embracing it. In that balance, the diversity of life reached new heights. The Ordovician has often been called a second explosion of biodiversity, following the Cambrian. Species multiplied in every habitat. Plankton in the open ocean, corals and sponges in reefs, trilobites and brachiopods on the sea floor. Each group adapted to its niche, refining rather than reinventing. The web of life became denser, the connections more intricate. If the Cambrian had been the birth of complexity, the Ordovician was its maturation. The reefs, as ever, were the anchor of this system. Their steady construction provided continuity through changing conditions. Even when sea levels fell and reefs were exposed, fragments of their structure served as seedbeds for new growth when the water returned. Fossil evidence shows how reefs migrated with the climate, shifting toward the equator as the poles cooled. The pattern was global, a slow drift of ecosystems following the warmth, like a planetary tide. The rhythm of the Earth also revealed itself in smaller seasonal cycles. The tilt of the planet's axis created variations in sunlight and temperature, just as it does today. These changes affected plankton blooms, coral growth rates, and animal reproduction. Some trilobites, for example, appear to have synchronized their molting cycles with the seasons, shedding their exoskeletons during specific times of year when food was abundant. In the structure of coral skeletons and the chemical signatures of shells, these annual rhythms are still recorded, faint but discernible lines that measure time in millennia of summers and winters. To imagine the Ordovician world in motion is to picture a system that never truly paused. The continents were still moving northward and southward, volcanic activity was continuous, and the climate oscillated between warm and cool. But instead of chaos, these processes now interacted in concert. The interplay of forces created predictability, enough for ecosystems to establish, enough for evolution to specialize. The planet had become self-organizing, and in that self-organization lay resilience. The result of this growing stability was an expansion of ecological depth. Life could now occupy a wider range of environments, from polar seas to equatorial lagoons, from shallow tidal flats to the deep ocean floor. The patterns of temperature, oxygen, and nutrients dictated where each community could thrive. This distribution created diversity not just in species but in ecosystems. Each region of the Earth developed its own character, its own rhythm within the global whole. Even the sediment layers on the seafloor mirrored these rhythms. Fine-grained muds alternated with coarser sands, reflecting shifts in currents and storms. Thin bands of volcanic ash marked moments of upheaval, while thick beds of limestone recorded long intervals of calm. Together, these layers formed the planet's memory, a record of motion written in rock. When we study these layers today, we are reading the pulse of the Ordovician world, the steady beat of Earth finding its rhythm. Yet, stability is never permanent. As the period progressed, the same forces that had created balance began to push it toward a new state. The ongoing drawdown of carbon dioxide cooled the planet further, while the growth of glaciers lowered sea levels more dramatically than before. The rhythm of the planet was steady, but its tempo was slowing. The warm intervals grew shorter, the cold ones longer. By the end of the Ordovician, the Earth would experience one of the first great mass extinctions, a consequence not of sudden catastrophe, but of the planet's own regulation taken too far. Still, before that shift arrived, there was harmony. The mid-Ordovician Earth was vibrant, balanced, and alive. The seas were full, the reefs immense, the atmosphere rich in oxygen. The continents, though barren on their surfaces, were ringed by ecosystems of immense productivity. It was a world that had learned how to sustain itself. The connection between land, sea and sky was now constant. Rain carried minerals to the ocean. Marine life transformed those minerals into shells and skeletons. When those shells settled and turned to rock, tectonic movement lifted them back to land, where they would erode again. The cycle was endless. Energy from the sun drove photosynthesis, which fueled life, which in turn altered the chemistry of the planet. Each component supported and constrained the others. The result was a steady heartbeat that would continue long after the Ordovician ended. The rhythm extended to the smallest scales. Within the cells of algae, chemical cycles mirrored those of the planet. Carbon absorbed, oxygen released, energy stored and spent. Within coral colonies, patterns of growth reflected the daily and seasonal changes of light. Within ecosystems, species interacted in feedback loops of predation and cooperation. Everywhere, the principle was the same: balance through motion. If one could somehow compress those millions of years into a few minutes, the Earth would seem to breathe. Oceans expanding and contracting, glaciers waxing and waning, reefs building and eroding, continents gliding in slow arcs. The motion would be graceful, almost musical, each part responding to the others. This was the rhythm of a planet in equilibrium, a rhythm that would endure through countless cycles of change. The Ordovician world, in its complexity and coherence, showed what Earth could be when its systems worked together. It was a preview of the stability that would allow life to flourish for the next several 100 million years. The reefs would collapse and rebuild, the ice would advance and retreat, species would vanish and new ones would rise. But the rhythm would persist. The planet had found its pattern, its long, slow pulse, its way of enduring time. And as that rhythm deepened, it carried within it the seeds of transformation. The balance that sustained life would one day falter, and from that faltering new forms would emerge. The ice was beginning to gather, unseen beneath southern skies, and with it, the next movement in Earth's long symphony, the quiet approach of the first great ending, and the promise of renewal that would follow. For millions of years, the Ordovician world had been thriving. The reefs stretched wide across the shallow seas, the plankton clouds shimmered near the surface, and the continents moved in their slow, unhurried drift beneath the sun. Life had found balance, and the Earth itself had learned to breathe in rhythm. But that balance, like all things on this planet, was not meant to last. Without warning, the rhythm began to falter. The planet entered a new phase, quiet, slow, and devastating. It would become one of the first great extinctions in Earth's history, a catastrophe measured not in explosions or impacts but in temperature, chemistry, and silence. The beginning of the end came softly. The air grew cooler, and the glaciers that had been confined to the southernmost reaches of Gondwana began to expand. Ice accumulated over millions of years, inching outward across the vast supercontinent. Each new layer of snow reflected more sunlight into space, reinforcing the cooling. The process fed itself, and the planet's thermostat began to slip toward cold. As ice grew, it locked away enormous amounts of water. Global sea levels fell, perhaps by more than 100 meters. The shallow seas that had covered much of the continents, the nurseries of Ordovician life, began to retreat. Reefs that had flourished for millions of years were left exposed to air. Coastlines shrank, habitats vanished, and vast tracts of the seafloor fell silent. It was not a single moment of destruction, but a slow withdrawal of the conditions that had made life abundant. The creatures that depended on warm, sunlit shallows were the first to suffer. Corals, stromatoporoids, and the intricate reef communities collapsed as the water receded. The brachiopods and bryozoans that had covered the seabed died in enormous numbers, their shells piling up like drifts of snow. Trilobites, once so adaptable, found fewer places to hide and fewer resources to feed upon. Plankton populations declined as temperatures dropped, starving the food web from the surface down. The ocean, once vibrant and noisy, grew quiet. In the deeper seas, the effects were different but equally severe. As the cold spread, the chemistry of the ocean changed. Cold water can hold more oxygen, but it also changes how nutrients circulate. The cooling disrupted the vertical mixing that brought nutrients from the depths to the surface. With less mixing, productivity declined. At the same time, ice sheets grinding over land altered the chemistry of runoff, changing the balance of minerals entering the sea. Entire ecosystems collapsed not from direct destruction but from deprivation, a slow starvation that spread through the food chain. Yet the planet itself was not cruel. The processes at work were natural, automatic, even predictable in hindsight. Life had drawn down too much carbon dioxide during its long productive age, and the climate had responded accordingly. The ice was simply the Earth's way of recalibrating. But to the living, this correction was absolute. The Ordovician extinction unfolded in two main waves, separated by a brief and deceptive pause. The first came with the onset of glaciation, the cooling, the falling sea levels, the collapse of reefs. Then, after millions of years, the ice began to melt. Sea levels rose again, flooding the continents once more. But the return of warmth brought chaos rather than relief. The sudden influx of cold, oxygen-rich water from melting glaciers disturbed the deep ocean, releasing nutrients and triggering blooms of plankton. These blooms consumed oxygen as they decayed, suffocating marine life in vast regions of anoxia. The second wave of extinction followed, completing the quiet catastrophe. By the time it ended, perhaps 80% of marine species were gone. The trilobites, so dominant for so long, lost many of their lineages. The great coral reefs of the Ordovician vanished entirely. Entire families of brachiopods and mollusks disappeared. The diversity that had taken millions of years to build was cut down in geological moments. The Earth's biosphere contracted, leaving behind a simpler, emptier world. And yet, even in its devastation, the extinction was not uniform. Some regions suffered more than others. The deep ocean, buffered from temperature swings, became a refuge for certain species. A few hardy brachiopods survived in colder waters, adapted to low oxygen and limited food. Some plankton endured by shifting toward new chemical tolerances. The resilience of life was revealed not in its abundance, but in its persistence. Even as most of the ocean went silent, small corners remained alive, holding the seeds of recovery. If you could have stood on the shores of that frozen world, you might not have recognized it as the same planet that had glowed with tropical warmth only a few million years before. The air would have been colder and thinner, the winds sharper, the once clear water would have seemed darker, reflecting the overcast skies above. Where reefs had risen, there would be only bare limestone. The smell of salt and decay would have lingered in the air, and beneath the waves a strange stillness, the kind that follows the end of a long storm. The quiet was perhaps the most striking thing. The Ordovician ocean had been filled with the constant hum of life, the movement of trilobite legs, the gentle sway of crinoid arms, the faint vibrations of predators gliding through water. Now, much of that had ceased. The sediment settled undisturbed. The reefs crumbled. The planet seemed to pause, as though catching its breath after centuries of motion. This silence was not permanent. Life has never been still for long. But in those millions of years of cold, the Earth was stripped back to its essentials. Only the most adaptable forms remained. Evolution, which had once focused on diversification, now turned to endurance. The survivors of this age would become the ancestors of everything that followed, the builders of the Silurian recovery, the origin of new lineages, the next architects of complexity. The extinction also reshaped the planet's chemistry in ways that would define the next era. As glaciers scraped across the continents, they exposed fresh rock to weathering. When the ice melted, rivers carried vast amounts of minerals into the sea, fertilizing it anew. This influx of nutrients eventually sparked a new wave of productivity, but it took time. The ecosystems that emerged were not the same as those that had vanished. Coral types changed. New species of plankton evolved, and early jawed fish began to appear. The world that came after was both a continuation and a reinvention. To understand the Ordovician extinction is to understand the fragility of balance. The same feedback loops that had sustained life, photosynthesis drawing down carbon, carbon burial cooling the planet, oxygen rising in the air, also made it vulnerable to overcorrection. Stability is a delicate thing. When one part of the system shifts too far, the others must follow, and recovery comes only after the pendulum has swung through its extremes. The quiet catastrophe was not a failure of life, but a reminder of its dependence on the planet's rhythms. When scientists study the rocks from this time, they see evidence of both destruction and renewal. Layers of glacial deposits mark the advance of ice. Black shales record the oxygen-poor seas that followed. Fossil assemblages show abrupt breaks. Diverse communities replaced by sparse, simplified ones. Yet above those barren layers, new fossils appear, marking the beginning of recovery. The pattern is unmistakable. Collapse, then regeneration. The extinction's legacy reaches far beyond its moment in time. By removing dominant species and clearing ecological space, it allowed new forms to evolve. The survivors diversified in the Silurian, creating new reefs, new food webs, new strategies for life. In a sense, the Ordovician extinction was a reset, a painful but necessary restructuring of the biosphere. The world that followed would be different, but it would also be stronger. It's easy to imagine extinction as sudden, dramatic, or violent, but the Ordovician event was mostly slow, quiet, and inexorable. There was no single explosion, no comet, no instant destruction. The world simply changed beyond what its inhabitants could endure. The temperature dropped a few degrees, the sea withdrew, the chemistry shifted, and life, which had built itself to thrive in one set of conditions, found itself unprepared for another. It was not a scream, but a fading. And yet, within that fading, evolution never stopped working. In the cold, isolated pockets where life clung on, adaptation continued. The species that survived did so because they could tolerate change. Cold water, low oxygen, scarcity. Those traits would serve them well in the world that came next. They were unknowingly the architects of recovery. In the aftermath, as the glaciers began to melt and the seas returned, the Earth entered a new chapter. The oceans refilled the empty basins, washing over the remains of the old reefs. New communities began to form on the freshly exposed seafloor. The first hints of coral recovery appeared, different from before but following familiar principles. Plankton diversified again, filling the water column with life. The quiet catastrophe gave way gradually to sound and motion once more. The Ordovician extinction was one of the great tests of life, a test that would be repeated many times throughout Earth's history. It showed that even the most complex systems could fail, and that recovery was not guaranteed but earned. Yet it also demonstrated that life is more resilient than any single crisis. Every extinction in the fossil record has been followed by renewal, every silence by new sound. The planet's rhythm may slow or stutter, but it never stops. If one could have watched those millions of years unfold in fast motion, the pattern would look almost peaceful. Glaciers advancing and retreating, sea levels rising and falling, the colours of the ocean shifting from blue to grey and back to blue. Life disappearing and then reappearing, slightly altered each time. It was destruction as part of the natural rhythm, the long, deep breathing of a planet finding its balance again. In the quiet of that age, when the ice was thick and the ocean sparse, the seeds of the future were already germinating. The survivors were small, simple, unremarkable. But from them would come the next wave of innovation, the return of reefs, the rise of fish. the greening of land. The Ordovician's end was not a full stop but a deep pause, a resting point before the next movement. And when the ice finally receded for the last time, the sunlight returned to the seas and warmth spread once more across the continents, life began to climb again toward abundance. The world was different now, colder, leaner, more experienced. It had endured loss and learnt resilience. The catastrophe had been quiet, but its lessons would echo through every age that followed. The ocean's silence would not last, the rhythm would resume, and out of that long stillness the earth would begin to sing again. When the ice of the Ordovician began to withdraw, the world revealed what it had become. The silence that had lingered over the seas was replaced by the slow return of motion. Meltwater from glaciers carved channels through the land, carrying fine sediments into the ocean. The air warmed by degrees. The shallows, once bare, began to fill again with life. And yet the world was not the same. Its memory had changed. The traces of all that had happened, the growth, the decline, the cold, were written into the planet itself. These were the echoes in stone, the lasting imprints of a world that had found its rhythm, lost it, and found it again. Stone does not remember in words or images. It remembers in texture, in layers, in chemistry. Every grain of sediment, every fossilized shell, every ripple preserved in rock is a record of time moving forward. In the cliffs and mountains that would later rise from ancient seabeds, the story of the Ordovician still lies quietly waiting to be read. Each layer is a page, and the language of geology, though slow, is exact. At first glance, a piece of Ordovician limestone looks ordinary, pale, fine-grained, almost featureless. But under magnification it reveals a world, tiny shells of plankton, broken fragments of coral, the outlines of trilobites, worm burrows and microbial films, all frozen in place. These are the remnants of the coral cities and quiet kingdoms that once covered the sea floor. Each fragment carries evidence of life's former abundance, of the calm intervals between the catastrophes. Deeper layers tell a different story. There, the grains are darker, finer and more compact. These are the sediments laid down during the glacial intervals, when the ocean was still and anoxic. They contain few fossils, just faint impressions of organic matter, the residue of a world in retreat. Above them, lighter layers return, marking the warming that followed. The pattern alternates, light for abundance, dark for scarcity. Even without fossils, the rhythm of life and death is recorded in the rock itself. In some places, thick bands of limestone alternate with thin seams of shale, creating a visual record of the Earth's heartbeat. The rise and fall of sea levels, the expansion and contraction of life. These patterns can be traced across continents, linking regions that were once connected by shallow seas. The same sequences appear in North America, Europe and parts of Asia, proof that the Ordovician world was global, its processes interconnected. Fossils became the voices within these layers. Long after the creatures themselves vanished, their shapes endured, pressed into the rock like the memory of touch. The trilobites in particular left an extraordinary record. Their shells, often preserved in perfect detail, show not just form but behaviour, tracks of movement, clusters that hint at migration, even injuries that healed over a lifetime. In some layers, thousands are found together, their final resting place a mass grave caused by a sudden event, a storm, a drop in oxygen, a shift in sediment. Each fossil is an echo of a life lived and ended in the rhythm of its time. The reefs too left their mark. Their skeletal frameworks turned to stone, forming thick beds of carbonate rock. In cross-section, these fossil reefs still resemble the living ones. Branching corals, layered sponges, tiny chambers that once held crinoids and mollusks. The textures are delicate, as if the ocean had simply been paused. Many of the world's great limestone formations, the cliffs of Wales, the plateaus of China, the Midwest of North America, were built from these remains. The mountains we see today were once the floors of Ordovician seas. The chemistry of the rocks carries even deeper information. Ratios of oxygen and carbon isotopes within fossils reveal changes in temperature and climate. Higher ratios indicate cooler times, lower ratios warmer ones. By measuring these variations through layers of stone, scientists can reconstruct the planet's climate curve, the rise and fall of ice, the pulse of carbon through the oceans. In these chemical traces, the quiet catastrophe is still visible, as a sharp swing followed by gradual recovery. It is a perfect record of the Earth's resilience. Even the microscopic details tell stories. Under the microscope, some fossils show evidence of stress. Shells that are thinner than normal, growth lines that waver or stop abruptly, indicating sudden environmental change. Others show adaptation, new patterns of ornamentation, thicker ridges, different chemical compositions that made them more resistant to acid or pressure. Evolution left its signature not in words, but in structure. There are places on Earth today where this record is so clear it feels almost immediate. In the cliffs of Ontario, in the limestone beds of Scandinavia, in the folded strata of the Appalachian Mountains, you can see the alternating bands of life and silence. Standing before them, you are looking directly at time. Hundreds of millions of years condensed into a vertical wall. The fossils within them are not just relics, they are participants in a story that continues. The calcium that once formed their shells is the same element that now strengthens the bones of animals, including us. The carbon they locked away shaped the air we breathe. The echoes of their existence are literally within our own chemistry. The fossils also show the continuity of adaptation. After the extinction, new species appeared, small, experimental forms testing the changed environment. Some trilobites evolved spines and more efficient limbs. Brachiopods developed thicker shells and new hinge mechanisms. Coral types shifted toward those that could tolerate cooler water. These subtle changes, recorded layer by layer, reveal evolution in motion, guided not by purpose but by persistence. The stone also remembers the recovery. In the layers above the extinction horizon, fossil diversity increases again. The first Silurian reefs begin to appear, different in composition but familiar in structure. The shells become more abundant, the sediments lighter. The dark anoxic layers give way to pale, oxygen-rich ones. The return of abundance is quiet but certain. The rhythm resumes. It is humbling to realize that the rocks beneath our feet are not static. They are the product of movement, pressure, and time. What was once mud becomes stone. What was once seabed becomes mountain. What was once reef becomes the foundation of cities. The planet recycles its history endlessly, each layer building upon the last. The Ordovician rocks we study today were themselves shaped by earlier worlds and would go on to influence later ones. They are both record and participant in the planet's ongoing evolution. When we hold a fossil, we hold the intersection of biology and geology, the exact point where life became memory. A shell that once filtered water, a coral that once grew towards sunlight, a trilobite that once scuttled across sand, all are now part of the mineral world. Their atoms have changed, but their forms remain. They are proof that nothing on Earth truly disappears, it only transforms. The echoes in stone are not only physical but chemical and atmospheric. The oxygen we breathe today, the balance of gases in the sky, the stability of climate, all were influenced by the life and death of Ordovician organisms. Their shells removed carbon from the air, cooling the planet. Their extinction released it again, warming it. Even their burial and compression affected the long-term carbon cycle. In this way, the rocks of that ancient world still shape the modern one. The air itself carries their signature. Every fossil is also a measure of time's scale. The thin layers that represent thousands of years, the thicker ones that represent millions. Together they remind us that change, whether creative or destructive, always takes time. To the creatures that lived through it, the shifts must have seemed slow. perhaps imperceptible. To us, looking back, they seem impossibly vast. The stone teaches perspective, showing that what feels permanent is only temporary on a larger scale. In the folds of mountains and the lines of cliffs, the Ordovician is still present. It underlies roads and cities, quarries and rivers. Its sediments form aquifers that hold fresh water. Its fossils enrich the soils that support forests and fields. The past is not buried beneath us. It is part of us, woven into the world we inhabit. Every step we take is across the compressed memory of oceans that once breathed, flourished, froze, and began again. The echoes in stone also tell us something about resilience. After the extinction, the Earth did not start over from nothing. It built upon what remained. The survivors carried forward the genetic and structural innovations that had evolved before the catastrophe. Life's recovery was not a return to the past, but a reorganization of what endured. That pattern, destruction followed by innovation, would repeat through every future extinction and every future age. In this sense, the Ordovician was the planet's first rehearsal for endurance. The systems that emerged from its challenges, the feedbacks between biology and climate, between ocean and land, would sustain Earth for the next 500 million years. Even mass extinction could not erase the memory written into the living fabric of the planet. The rocks remember, but so does life. When we study these ancient layers, we're not just looking at the past, we're observing how the planet works. The interplay of carbon, oxygen and temperature that governed the Ordovician still governs the world now. The balance that collapsed then is the same one that supports us today. The lesson of those rocks is not simply that life recovers, but that the systems we depend on are delicate and deeply interconnected. The echo in stone is a warning as much as a memory. And yet, there is comfort in it too. The Earth has been through collapse before. It has frozen, burned, flooded, and frozen again. Each time, life has returned, reshaped but undiminished. The rhythm reasserts itself, as certain as the turning of the planet. The Ordovician extinction was immense, but it was not final. The world that rose from it was richer and more intricate, the foundation for all that would follow: fish, forests, and eventually us. If you could listen closely enough, perhaps you could hear it. The faint sound of time moving through stone. Not a voice, not a melody, but a pulse. The compression of millions of years into silence. The rocks do not speak, but they answer when we ask the right questions. They tell us that change is inevitable, that endings are beginnings in disguise, and that life, even when it falters, never truly stops. The Ordovician may have ended in ice and loss, but it left behind the architecture of endurance, the knowledge, encoded in molecules and minerals, of how to adapt, how to persist, how to begin again. Those lessons still guide every living thing, from the simplest microbe to the most complex species. They are the heartbeat beneath the crust, the rhythm within the stone. And as the next ages unfolded, as the Silurian seas warmed, as reefs returned, as fish began to rise from the depths, the echoes of the Ordovician continued to resound. The world remembered what it had survived. The rocks kept the record. The rhythm endured. Long after the Ordovician seas had receded and the reefs had turned to limestone beneath the shifting continents, the memory of that ancient water remained everywhere. It lingered in the shape of the land, in the chemistry of the air, and in the slow rhythm of life that continued to unfold above and below the surface. The oceans had been the first cradle, the place where every form of movement, structure, and thought had begun. Even as life prepared to climb fully onto land, the sea held its influence over everything that followed. The memory of water was not just geological or biological, it was planetary, written into the foundation of the earth and the behaviour of every living thing. The ocean had shaped the continents long before life ever touched their edges. Through erosion, sedimentation, and the weight of tides, It had carved coasts, moulded valleys, and built layers of stone that would one day rise into mountains. When the Ordovician glaciers melted, the runoff filled ancient basins and carved new rivers that traced the outlines of vanished seas. The Earth's surface still bore the imprint of water's passage, the quiet sculpting that never ceased. Even now, in the modern world, many of the oldest rocks visible above ground carry marks left by those primeval tides, ripple patterns, mud cracks, the traces of organisms that once moved through shallow water. They are the fingerprints of the first oceans, pressed into stone and left behind like the handwriting of time. But the memory of water ran deeper than the surface. It persisted in the way life itself was built. The chemistry of living cells, the balance of salts, the structure of membranes, the composition of cytoplasm, all mirrored the seawater in which life first evolved. Every living organism, even those that have never seen the ocean, carries that ancient chemistry within. The salt in blood, the ions that regulate nerves and muscles, the fluid that cushions every cell, all are echoes of the primordial sea. The body remembers what the planet once was. Evolution may have led life onto land, but it never erased its dependence on water. It simply brought the ocean inside. During the Ordovician, that bond between life and water deepened in ways that would endure for the rest of Earth's history. The ocean became not just a home, but a regulator, a stabilizer of temperature, a reservoir of carbon, a network connecting every corner of the biosphere. The patterns of circulation that formed during that time, the mixing of deep and shallow layers, the transfer of heat from equator to pole, became permanent features of the planet's climate system. Even as continents shifted and species changed, the logic of those currents persisted. The ocean had learned how to keep the world in motion. The end of the Ordovician showed just how powerful that memory could be. When the ice advanced and the seas retreated, the planet cooled sharply. When the ice melted and the seas returned, warmth and balance followed. The oceans were the Earth's equilibrium system, constantly adjusting to maintain conditions suitable for life. They absorbed heat, stored carbon, and circulated nutrients. Without that immense capacity for regulation, the planet would have swung violently between extremes. The memory of water was, in part, the memory of stability. In the centuries after the extinction, as the world entered the Silurian, new reefs began to grow again, nourished by the minerals washed down from glacial erosion. Algae recolonized the shallows, plankton filled the open seas, and the web of life rewove itself with quiet persistence. Each recovery was a repetition of what had come before, slightly altered, slightly improved. The oceans remembered how to heal, because they had done it countless times before. Each species that survived carried a genetic record of endurance, a biological echo of resilience. To understand how deeply the ocean remembers, it helps to think of time not as a line, but as a tide. The water that evaporates into the air today is not new. It has circulated through the atmosphere, the rivers, and the seas for billions of years. Every raindrop that falls contains molecules that once moved through Ordovician clouds, or through the gills of trilobites, or through the pores of coral. The ocean's molecules are ancient and unbroken, passed endlessly from form to form. In a very real sense, the water that fills today's oceans is the same that filled the world 500 million years ago. Filtered, rearranged, but unchanged in essence. The memory of the Ordovician is not confined to stone. It still moves with the waves. The sediment layers that built up during those ancient ages continue to shape the planet today. As tectonic forces lift and fold them, they become mountains and plains. The carbon stored in those rocks is slowly released back into the air through weathering, volcanic activity, or human industry. Every atom that was once part of a shell or a coral reef eventually returns to circulation. The cycle never ends. The memory of water is also the memory of transformation. A constant movement from one state to another, from living to mineral to atmospheric and back again. The creatures of the Ordovician, though long gone, still influence the world through these cycles. Their shells became limestone, their carbon built mountains, their oxygen filled the sky. The very composition of the air that later supported forests and animals was set by the balance struck in those ancient seas. The coral cities that once glowed beneath Ordovician sunlight did not vanish. They changed form, becoming the bedrock of future continents and the framework of future ecosystems. The continuity between ocean and land, between past and present, is unbroken. The Earth remembers everything. If you walk along a modern coastline and look at the patterns of waves, the lines of foam, the shifting sand, all of it moves with the same rhythm that governed the Ordovician tides. The moon's pull, the rotation of the planet, the thermal expansion of water. None of it has changed. The physics of tides and currents is ancient, one of the few constants that bridge all ages of the Earth. The same cycles that shaped the reefs and fed the plankton 500 million years ago still shape the coasts we know now. When the tide rises, when a wave breaks, it is repeating an action that has never ceased since the first oceans formed. And within those waves, there are still the descendants of Ordovician survivors, the nautiloids, now smaller but unmistakably familiar, the corals reimagined in new forms, the plankton, endlessly dividing and drifting. The ocean remembers not only in chemistry and motion, but in lineage. The genetic threads that began in those ancient waters continue to weave through the tapestry of life today. The creatures that swim in modern seas are carrying stories older than the continents themselves. What makes this continuity remarkable is how unintentional it is. The ocean does not remember in order to preserve. It simply follows the rules of physics and biology, and those rules ensure that nothing is ever entirely lost. Energy and matter circulate. Life and death balance one another, and memory is carried forward as consequence. The same chemical bonds that built the shells of Ordovician corals form the bones of animals now. The same carbon atoms that cooled the planet then warm it today. Memory, in the planetary sense, is not sentiment, it is process. The rocks that once lay beneath Ordovician waters are among the most studied in the world. They hold not just fossils, but isotopic records that allow scientists to reconstruct the planet's past in extraordinary detail. In their oxygen isotopes, we see temperature. In their carbon signatures, we see productivity and extinction. In the tiny air bubbles trapped in minerals, we glimpse ancient atmospheres. These stones are quite literally the planet's diary, an unbroken account written by water and pressure, preserved for those who learn to read it. If we could hear the sound of those ancient oceans, it might surprise us how familiar it would seem. The slow crash of waves against rock, the hiss of foam, the murmur of currents moving through coral structures, these are the oldest sounds the Earth has ever made. Even now the ocean speaks in the same tones. It is the one voice that has never gone silent, the background hum beneath every era. Its cadence is the rhythm by which the planet measures itself. The memory of water is not only physical, it is auditory. It continues in every wave that breaks against the shore, in every current that stirs the deep. When life finally came fully onto land, it brought the sea with it. The first plants, rising from the damp soil of the Silurian, carried within them the same mechanisms that algae had used underwater, the same chlorophylls, the same dependence on light and moisture. The first animals to breathe air still required humidity to keep their bodies from drying. Even the earliest insects and amphibians laid their eggs in water, unable to sever that ancestral tie. Evolution advanced, but it never escaped its origin. Every living thing is a continuation of that first fluid environment, still bound by the properties of the element that made life possible. Over the eons that followed, the continents would join, break apart and drift again. Mountains would rise and crumble. The climate would warm and cool countless times. But through it all, the ocean remained constant in its role. sometimes retreating, sometimes advancing, but always shaping the Earth's surface and the life upon it. Its memory became the planet's foundation. Every wave that touched the land carried a whisper of all that had come before, all the ages it had already witnessed. To stand by the sea now, at any coast, is to stand before deep time. The line of the horizon is the same line seen by Ordovician creatures, the same division between water and sky that has framed every era. Beneath that surface lies the continuous record of life's history. Not separate oceans, but one great enduring body that has changed shape without ever ending. The water before us is ancient, recycled through time but never truly gone. It holds the minerals of vanished mountains, the salts of long-evaporated basins, and the remnants of the first living cells. It holds the memory of ice, of heat, of silence, of noise. The ocean's patience is unmatched. It has seen every extinction, every renewal, every attempt at permanence. It has dissolved mountains and buried cities, nurtured life and erased its traces, and through it all, it has remained the same element, adaptive, enduring, infinite in motion. The memory of water is not nostalgia but continuity. It is the proof that even the most fragile systems can persist through transformation. The Ordovician oceans, with all their brilliance and destruction, were one expression of that continuity, a single verse in the planet's longer composition. The reefs that grew there, the glaciers that followed, the silence that came after, all of it was part of the same unbroken flow. The water that shaped that world is still here, moving through us, returning to the sea, beginning again. If we think of the Earth as a living system, then water is its memory, circulating endlessly, carrying the story of every age within it. It remembers the warmth of Ordovician suns, the weight of its own ice, the chemistry of vanished life. It remembers how to cool a planet, how to sustain it, how to start over when balance fails. It is not conscious, but it is constant. Its motion is the measure of time, its persistence the measure of life itself. And as the waves continue to fall against the shore, as rain moves through rivers back into the sea, the memory remains unbroken. The same molecules that once lifted over Ordovician reefs now rise through clouds above us. The same rhythms that guided trilobites and corals still guide the climate and the pulse of ecosystems today. The memory of water never fades, because it is not a story told once. It is the story itself, continuing, repeating, never ending. The earth turns, the tides move, the air changes, and still the ocean endures, remembering everything.